Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The wind came first. A long, low exhalation from the throat of the valley. It did not howl, nor did it whisper. It simply slid through the sleeping town of Blackwater, a river of air that carried the scent of wet pine and cold, turned to earth. It slipped under doors, finding the cracks in old homes, and it stirred the chimes on Frida's porch, the ones Darius had hung for her birthday, the ones that now played a hollow, tuneless song in the dark. The sound was a question, and the silence that followed was the answer. Darius woke with a pressure behind his eyes, a deep, tectonic ache that seemed to root itself in the bone of his forehead. He pushed himself up in the bed that was too large, in the house that was too quiet, and his hands went to his temples. The skin was hot, tight, like a drumhead. He stumbled to the bathroom, his body moving through the familiar darkness of a grief that was 3 months old. He did not turn on the light. He did not need to. He faced the mirror, a pale shape in the gloom, and waited for his vision to adjust. They were not there, and then they were. 2 dark protrusions, still soft at the tips, curving up and out from just above his hairline. They felt like polished wood, like old bone. He touched one, and a jolt, not of pain but of profound and terrible recognition, shot through him. It was the feeling of a key turning in a lock he had not known existed. He stared, his breath caught in his throat, and in the deep silence of the house, the wind chimes on the porch sang their empty song once more. The days that followed were a blur of shadow and evasion. He called in sick to the garage, a lie that felt thin and brittle the moment he spoke it. He wore a beanie pulled low, but the fabric chafed against the nubs, which were hardening, lengthening, taking on a ridged, spiraled form. They itched with a phantom sensation, as if something were trying to bloom from within his skull. He avoided mirrors, but he could not avoid the feeling. It was a weight, a new center of gravity for his body and his sorrow. He had to know. He had to find out who had given him this, and why. Frida was gone. Her car found crumpled against the old oak on Miller's Run, the case closed, an accident. But these horns, were not an accident. They were a statement. They were a question he was now forced to ask the world. His first test was with his mother. He went to her house for Sunday dinner, the beanie a desperate, foolish shield. She fussed over him, her eyes red-rimmed and perpetually damp. She made pot roast, his favorite, the smell of it thick and cloying in the small kitchen. "You're not eating, honey," she said, her hand on his arm. "You're so thin." He looked at her, and the pressure behind his eyes intensified, a low thrum building to a hum. "I'm trying, Mom." Her smile was fragile. "I know. We all miss her so much. Such a sweet girl." The hum became a vibration. He felt the horns, warm against the inside of the beanie. His mother's eyes, fixed on his, seemed to lose focus for a moment. Her smile faltered. Her hand tightened on his arm, her knuckles white. "She was," Darius said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. And then his mother spoke. Her voice, a dry rustle, utterly unlike her own. "I never liked her china pattern. So garish. I was glad when she didn't take the heirloom set. I didn't want her clumsy hands on it." She blinked, her face a mask of confusion. What did I just say?" Darius stared, his appetite gone, the taste of pot roast like ash. He had drawn it out of her, this small, hidden meanness she had kept tucked away behind a wall of sympathy. The horns had pulled the truth from its hiding place, a rotten tooth from a healthy-looking gum. The world began to curdle around him. At the grocery store, the cashier, a woman who always asked about his day, looked at him, and her smile became a grimace. "My feet are killing me," she said, her voice flat, "and I hate every single one of you for making me stand here." The man behind him in line, a respected deacon, muttered under his breath, "I'm going to take the money from the collection plate. God will understand. My wife needs a new television." The truth was a poison, and he was the source. The horns were a dowsing rod for the rot in men's souls. He walked through Blackwater and felt the hidden sins bubbling to the surface, a cacophony of quiet hatreds, petty jealousies, and profound cruelties. The town was not the placid, grieving place he had thought it was. It was a septic tank, and he had just pulled the plug. He went to see Isaias, his oldest friend, the one who had introduced him to Frida Dart. They sat on the back porch of Isaiah's tidy little house, looking out over the lake. The water was the color of slate, perfectly still. "How are you holding up, man?" Isaias asked, handing him a beer. His eyes were kind, full of a shared history that stretched back to childhood forts and stolen cigarettes. Darius kept his head down, the brim of his baseball cap low. "Getting by. She was the best of us, D," Isaiah said, his voice thick. "The absolute best." The pressure started, a familiar, unwelcome throb. The horns felt heavy, a crown of lead. He looked at Isaias, at the sincere grief on his friend's face, and he felt a surge of guilt. But he had to know. He had to know if there was a reason, a source for this curse. "I miss her every second," Darius said, the words a key. Isaias's face went slack. The grief in his eyes did not vanish, but it was joined by something else, something ugly and frantic that swam up from the depths. "You think you're the only one." His voice was a harsh whisper, stripped of its warmth. "I loved her too. I loved her before you even knew her name. I told her not to go out that night. I told her it was you, that you were no good for her, that you'd never be able to give her what she needed. I said maybe you'd both be better off if something just happened." They'd undone. Nani Felbir. The world stopped. The lapping of the water against the dock, the call of a distant bird. It all faded into a high-pitched hum in Darius' ears. He stared at his friend, at the man who had been his brother. The confession hung between them, not an admission of murder, but something almost worse. A wish. A dark, secret desire sent out into the universe, a prayer for tragedy. Isaias's hands flew to his mouth, his eyes wide with horror. "Darius, I don't know why I said that." But Darius knew. The horns knew. They had found the crack in the foundation, the hidden fault line that ran through his friend's soul. Was it enough to cause a curse? Was a poisonous wish enough to summon a cosmic punishment? He left without a word, Isaiah's choked sobs following him into the twilight. He walked, not knowing where he was going, the weight on his head unbearable. He found himself at the edge of the woods, at the foot of the path that led to the old quarry. This was where he and Frida had come to be alone, to swim in the deep cold water under the stars. He descended the rocky path, the trees closing in around him. The air grew colder, smelling of damp stone and deep water. He reached the edge of the quarry, a vast, black eye staring up at the bruised purple sky. He took off his cap and let the cold air touch the horns. They felt alive, thrumming with a power that was both his and not his. He looked into the dark water, and his reflection looked back. But it was not his reflection. The face was his, gaunt and haunted, but the horns were different. They were larger, more intricate, woven with what looked like strands of shadow and starlight. And in the water, He did not see himself alone. He saw Frida. Her face was pale, her hair floating around her like a dark halo. She was not smiling. She was looking at him, through him. Her eyes full of a sadness so vast it threatened to swallow the world. Her lips did not move, but a voice filled his mind. A sound like the wind through the pines, like the ringing of distant chimes. It is not a curse for a crime, my love. It is a key for a lock. The lock was his grief, his rage, his need for an answer. The key was the terrible, unvarnished truth. The world is not what you thought it was. People are not who you think they are. You asked for a reason, and you were given the means to find it. But the reason is not a single act. It is the accumulation of every small hidden sin. It is the weight of every unspoken wish. It is the world as it truly is. He understood then. The horns were not a punishment for Frida's death. They were a response to his own desperate, screaming need to understand why. The universe, in its cold, indifferent logic, had answered. It had given him the ability to see the machinery of human failing, the endless interconnected web of petty malice and weakness that constituted reality. Isaiah's jealous was a single thread. His mother's quiet disdain was another. The cashier's resentment, the deacon's greed, all of it was part of the tapestry. Frida's death was not a single point of evil, but a confluence of a million tiny human darknesses. He had been searching for a monster, and he had found that the monster was the town. The monster was his friend. The monster was, in some small, hidden way, a part of the very grief that defined him. He did not scream. He did not cry. A profound and terrible calm settled over him. Transformation was complete. He was no longer Darius, the grieving man. He was the vessel for the truth. He was the question to which everyone had a terrible answer. He stood and walked back towards the lights of Blackwater. He did not put his cap back on. Let them see. Let them come. The wind picked up again, flowing down from the quarry over the town. It carried no message now. It was just the wind. And in the houses, people slept, their secret hearts beating in the dark, waiting for the man with the horns to walk by their window, to draw out the poison, to show them what they truly were. The story was over. The truth was just beginning, and the silence that followed was no longer an answer, but a waiting. The first house he came to was the Millers', their porch light a sickly yellow in the encroaching dark. He did not stop. He did not even turn his head. But as he passed the picket fence, their dog, an old hound named Buster, began not to bark, but to whine. A low, terrified sound as it pressed its belly into the dirt. The truth of its fear reached him without words, a pure, animal certainty. He walked on. He moved through the streets not like a man, but like a weather front. A car slowed as it approached him, its headlights illuminating the grotesque spirals crowning his head. It was Mr. Henderson, the high school principal. He stared, his mouth agape, and then his foot slammed on the accelerator, the car lurching away with a squeal of tires. Darius felt the man's terror. A sharp, acrid taste in the back of his own throat, mingled with the shame of a memory Henderson himself had buried. The time, he had altered a student's transcript for a bribe. The truth leaked from him like steam. He found he did not need to speak, or even to make eye contact. His mere presence was a catalyst. On a dimly lit corner, two teenagers, locked in a clumsy embrace, broke apart as he drew near. The boy, instead of pulling the girl closer, took a step back, his face a mask of sudden, brutal clarity. "I don't even like you," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I just heard you were easy." The girl's gasp was a small, wounded thing in the vast silence, and the boy looked horrified at his own words, at the venom the horns had drawn from him. This was his purpose now. He was a mirror, and every soul he passed was compelled to look into it and see their own hidden face. He was not judging. He was simply revealing. The town of Blackwater, stripped of its pleasant lies and social niceties, was a raw, bleeding nerve. A woman looked out her window, saw him, and immediately turned on her husband, who was watching television. "I've been sleeping with your brother for 5 years," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. The words hung in the living room. A bomb that had finally detonated. He walked towards the center of town, towards the town square with its manicured grass and its proud empty war memorial. A few people were there, gathered in small, nervous clusters. They saw him coming. They pointed. They whispered. But as he drew closer, the whispers died. The truth did not like to be whispered. It demanded to be shouted. A man, red-faced and portly, stepped forward. It was Mayor Gibbons. "You, stop this." "What are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling with the authority that was already crumbling. Darius stopped. He looked at the mayor. He said nothing. The pressure built. The mayor's eyes bulged slightly. His jaw worked. "The funds for the new school wing," he blurted out, his voice cracking. "They're gone. I lost them. I lost them in a bad investment. I was going to fix it. I was going to find the money. I just needed more time." The confession echoed across the square. The small crowd stared, their faces a mixture of shock and a dawning, ugly satisfaction. Someone else's sin was a relief from their own. This was the pattern. This was the new world. He was the engine of a terrible, necessary apocalypse. He thought of Frida, not as the perfect memory he had cherished, but as the real, complicated woman the horns would have revealed. He knew, with a certainty that was both awful and peaceful, that he would have discovered her own small secrecies, her hidden disappointments in him. The perfect love he mourned was another lie, another facet of the beautiful, brittle fiction that was human life. He did not stop walking. He moved through the center of town and out the other side, leaving a wake of shattered lives and brutal honesty. He did not look back. The road stretched out before him, leading out of the valley. Blackwater was just the beginning. The horns were not a key for a single lock. They were a master key for every locked heart in the world. The wind stirred the leaves on the trees lining the road. It carried no scent now, no message. It was simply air moving from a place of high pressure to a place of low pressure. It was a natural force, like him. He walked on, his shadow stretching long and twisted behind him in the light of the rising moon. A figure of bone and truth, leaving a broken town to pick up the pieces of its own revealed soul. His journey was just beginning. The silence that followed him was no longer awaiting. It was the quiet of the world, holding its breath. He walked until the asphalt gave way to gravel, and the gravel to a dirt track that wound up into the foothills. The lights of Blackwater were a dim, shimmering puddle in the valley below, a constellation of exposed secrets. He felt no triumph, no vengeance, only a hollow, relentless purpose. The horns were a part of him now, as integral as his own skeleton, their weight a constant reminder of his function. A car engine coughed and sputtered behind him, headlights painting the pine trunks in stark, moving relief. It was an old pickup truck, rust eating at its wheel wells. It slowed to a crawl beside him, and the passenger window rolled down. The face that appeared was young, a man maybe in his early 20s, with a nervous energy that vibrated in the air between them. "Hey, man," the driver said, his eyes flicking up to Darius's head and then quickly away, as if burned. You need a ride somewhere?" Darius stopped walking. He turned his head and looked into the car. The pressure began, a low thrumming that was becoming as natural as his own heartbeat. The young man's name was Leo. Darius knew this without asking. He knew Leo had stolen the truck from his uncle's barn 2 days ago. He knew Leo was running from a bad debt and a broken promise to a girl in the next county. "Just heading on," Darius said, his voice rough from disuse. Leo's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The truth was a physical pressure in the cab of the truck. "I saw you back in the square. With the mayor. That was. Something else." He licked his lips. "Is it true, what they're saying? That you can make people say things?" Darius didn't answer. He simply waited. Leo's composure cracked. The words tumbled out. A frantic, desperate confession. "I wasn't going to keep it. I just needed to get away just for a little while. I was gonna send him money, I swear. And Janie. I told her I loved her. I didn't. I just didn't want to be alone. I'm so tired of being alone. I'm so tired of being alone." He was crying now, hot, shameful tears. "What's wrong with me? Why am I telling you this?" "Because it is the truth," Darius said, his tone flat, final. "It is the only thing left." He began walking again. The truck idled for a moment, and then the engine revved, and it sped off, spraying a plume of dust and gravel. Darius knew Leo would drive until he ran out of gas, and then he would walk. And the memory of this encounter would fester inside him, a raw, open wound of self-knowledge. That was the gift. That was the curse. He crested a rise and looked down at a new valley, dotted with the lights of another sleeping town. It looked no different from Blackwater. It would be full of the same secrets, the same small human betrayals waiting for a key. He felt the horns pulse, a dull, anticipatory ache. They were hungry. He started down the slope, his movement steady and inevitable. He was no longer a man with a past. He was a phenomenon, a truth that walked on two legs. The wind moved through the branches of the trees, and it sounded like 1,000 voices whispering all at once, a chorus of confession waiting for its conductor to arrive. He did not hurry. They would all be waiting for him sooner or later. Every last one. The first house on the outskirts of this new town was a trailer with a neat garden and a plastic flamingo stuck in the lawn. A television's blue glow flickered behind the curtains. As Darius passed the mailbox, the front door flew open and a woman stood silhouetted against the light, a phone pressed to her ear. "I don't care how late it is, Mother," she was saying, her voice sharp with practiced irritation. Then she saw him. She froze. The phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the porch floor. Darius kept walking, but the pressure built, a swift, sharp current pulling at the hidden things inside her. "He's not on business trip," she said, her voice no longer her own, but a hollow, truthful thing. "I haven't told anyone. I haven't told anyone. I water his stupid plants and pretend his car's in the shop." She began to sob, not from sadness, but from the sheer violent relief of the confession finally being out. She looked at Darius, her eyes wide with a strange, terrified gratitude. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. He moved past her trailer and into the town proper. A place called Elmwood according to the faded welcome sign. A police cruiser was parked outside a diner, its engine idling. The officer inside was sipping coffee from a paper cup. He saw Darius, did a double take, and then scrambled out of the car, his hand going to his belt. "You! Stop right there!" the officer commanded, his voice booming with a confidence he did not feel. The thrumming in Darius' skull intensified, focusing on the man like a lens. Darius stopped. He turned. The officer's mouth opened, but the order to put his hands up never came. Instead, his face went slack. "I planted the evidence on Mickey's shore," he said, his voice a monotone. "He was sleeping with my wife. I knew he was innocent of the burglary. I didn't care." The confession hung in the quiet night air. The officer's eyes widened in horror, his hand falling away from his weapon. He took a stumbling step backward, as if the words themselves had physical force. Darius walked on. Here was a stone dropped into the still pond of Elmwood, and the ripples were truths, spreading out in every direction. A curtain twitched in an upstairs window. A man saw him, and immediately turned to his wife sleeping beside him and shook her awake. "I lost my job," he whispered, the secret he'd carried for a month finally bursting out. "We have no savings. We're going to lose the house." He did not need to seek anyone out. They found him, or their secrets found him, drawn out by his proximity. A teenager, sneaking out her bedroom window, saw him from her roof, and instead of climbing down, she called out into the night, her voice clear and sharp. "I'm pregnant, and I'm not keeping it." The words were for no one and for everyone. He reached the town's single main street. People were emerging from the bars and the late-night laundromat, drawn by the strange electric disturbance in the air. They formed a loose, wary circle around him, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and a desperate, morbid curiosity. They were an audience waiting for a show they dreaded. A woman pushed to the front of the crowd. She was in her 60s, with a kind, worn face, the sort who organized church bake sales. She pointed a trembling finger at Darius. "This is a sin," she cried, her voice trembling with righteous fury. "You are a devil. You are tormenting good people." Darius looked at her. The pressure built, swift and sure. It was different with her, deeper. The horns hummed, sensing a truth that was not a single petty crime, but the bedrock of a life. The woman's face contorted. The anger melted away, replaced by a profound, weary emptiness. "There is no God," she said, and her voice was the driest rustle, the sound of absolute certainty. "I've been pretending for 40 years. I say the prayers and I lead the hymns, and I feel nothing but the silence. I do it because I'm afraid of what happens if I stop. I'm a liar, the biggest liar in this whole town." The crowd was utterly silent. The foundation of their world, the kindly church lady, had just declared it a hollow shell. The truth was not just about stolen money or secret affairs. It was about the vast, empty spaces where faith was supposed to be. Darius turned from them and continued his walk down the main street. The circle of people parted for him no longer a barrier, but an opening. He was not their problem to solve. He was their reality to face. He left them standing in the street, staring at the woman who had lost her faith and at each other, wondering what would be pulled from them when he passed by their own windows tomorrow, or the next day. He walked to the other end of Elmwood and started up the next hill. The horns felt heavier, denser. They were growing, fed by the constant harvest. He knew, with a certainty that was as deep as the silence the church lady had described, that this would not end. There was no town that would be different. There was no heart that was pure. He was a perpetual motion machine of revelation, and his fuel was the endless hidden failings of the world. He crested the hill and saw the distant glow of city lights smearing the horizon. A whole new ocean of secrets. The wind picked up, cold and indifferent. It was just the wind, and he was just the truth, and he walked on. The city was not like the towns. It did not sleep in the same way. Its secrets were not tucked under porches and behind picket fences, but stacked high in steel and glass, layered over one another in a hum of constant, frantic denial. He walked down the off-ramp and onto the first city street, the horns a dull, resonant weight against the new soundtrack of sirens and distant traffic. The air tasted of exhaust and ozone, and underneath it, the thick, coppery tang of a million hidden thoughts. People hurried past him, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. They glanced at him, at the twisted, bony spirals, and their reactions were quicker, more dismissive. A weirdo. A performance artist. They had categories for strangeness here, mental boxes to seal away the uncomfortable. But the boxes were not strong enough. A woman in a business suit, talking loudly into her Bluetooth headset, fell silent as he passed. "I can't close the deal, Frank," she said, her voice suddenly small and defeated. "I faked the data. The projections are all lies." She stood frozen on the sidewalk as the person on the other end of the line shouted unheard questions. A group of teenagers loitering outside a corner store, their bravado a thin shell, fell into a sudden vicious argument. "You think I'm stupid?" one yelled, shoving another. "I know you're the one who told them about my brother." The truth, once released, sought its own violent equilibrium. He was a rock in a river of lies, and the water parted around him in chaotic, truth-telling eddies. He walked for blocks, then miles. The pressure inside his skull was a constant, low-grade storm, pulling at the hidden faults in everyone he neared. A doorman confessed to stealing packages. A taxi driver admitted to rigging his meter. A couple in a park, holding hands, suddenly let go as the man muttered, "I'm married." The city tried to absorb him, to treat him as just another piece of its noise and chaos. But he was the antithesis of noise. He was the signal to which all falsehood was static. He found himself in a vast neon-lit square, surrounded by towering buildings that seemed to lean in, watching. A crowd was gathered for a late-night rally, listening to a politician speak from a floodlit podium. The man's voice was polished, powerful, full of promises and shared values. Darius stopped at the edge of the crowd. He looked up at the politician. He did not need to push. The connection was instant, a live wire of truth. The politician was in mid-sentence, his hand chopping the air for emphasis. "And that is why we must stand together for the future of our children." He stopped. His jaw worked. His eyes, wide with a terror he could not control, scanned the crowd until they locked onto Darius. The crowd murmured, confused. "The children," the politician said, his voice cracking. Then he laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I can't stand children. Nasty, sticky creatures." The crowd gasped. He gripped the podium, his knuckles white. But the truth was a flood he could not dam. "I took the money from the education fund. All of it. I bought a yacht. It's named the Public Trust." He began to sob, great, heaving, humiliating sobs, as his aides rushed the stage and the crowd erupted into a roar of fury and disbelief. Darius turned away. The revelation was complete. The scale was larger, but the sin was the same. It was all the same. He walked until he found a bridge spanning a dark, sluggish river. He stopped in the center, leaning on the railing, looking down at the water that reflected nothing but the ambient glow of the city. For the first time since Blackwater, he felt a flicker of something other than purpose. It was a profound, cosmic loneliness. He was the only one of his kind. There was no one to reflect his own truth back at him, because his truth was this endless, wearying function. What was his own hidden sin? The horns did not say. They were the instrument, and instruments do not play themselves. A final figure approached him on the bridge, an old man shuffling along with a shopping cart full of his possessions. The man smelled of old sweat and city grime. He stopped a few feet from Darius, his eyes not on the horns, but on his face. "I seen you on the television back there," the old man rasped, pointing a grimy thumb back towards the square. "You're the one making them talk." Darius said nothing. The old man nodded, as if this confirmed something. "Figured you'd come along eventually." He didn't seem afraid. He seemed resigned. He looked out at the city lights. "Ain't got no secrets left," he said. "Lost them all years ago. Just the truth now. It's cold, but it's light. Don't have to carry nothing." He gave a wheezing cough and shuffled on, his cart rattling, leaving Darius alone on the bridge. The man's words settled into him. The truth was cold, but it was light. It was the absence of the weight. Darius pushed himself away from the railing. The horizon was beginning to lighten, a thin gray line separating the monstrous buildings from the sky. Another day, another city, or perhaps the next neighborhood in this endless one. The horns throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a rhythm that was now the rhythm of the world. He was not a man. He was a process. He was the great, unwelcome unveiling. And he walked on. The dawn light did not warm him. It simply revealed more of the same. The city's grand facade, stripped of its nighttime glamour, looked tired and stained. He moved through the waking streets as the early commuters began to fill the sidewalks. The effect was slower, more insidious in the daylight. A man in a crisp suit, sipping coffee, suddenly dropped his cup as he passed, turning to the stranger next to him. "I'm going to be evicted," he whispered, the words a stark contrast to his expensive clothes. The stranger, a woman with a tired face, simply nodded and said, "My son won't speak to me." I was a terrible mother. They stood for a moment, two isolated truths in the rushing crowd, before moving on, forever changed. He was a contagion of candor, and the city was a petri dish. He walked into a small, steamy cafe. The clatter of dishes and the hiss of the espresso machine fell silent as he entered. The barista, a young woman with a tattoo of a bird on her wrist, looked up. Her smile died. The pressure built, a familiar, tightening band around the room. "I water down the vanilla syrup," she said, her voice flat. "The owner makes me. He buys the cheap beans and tells me to say they're fair trade." A man at a corner table, hunched over a laptop, slammed it shut. "I'm not writing a novel," he announced to the quiet room. "I just look at the screen and feel sick." The truth was not always dramatic. Often it was just sad. The quiet, pathetic reality behind the small efforts to seem more. He left the cafe without a word. The noise of the street did not return to normal behind him. It was punctuated by sobs, by shouted accusations, by the soft, crumbling sound of lives being rearranged by a single, uninvited fact. He was a scythe, and the harvest was perpetual. He found himself drawn to a large, modern building of glass and steel, a corporate headquarters. The automatic doors slid open for him. The lobby was a vast, cold space of marble and polished metal. A security guard stepped forward, his hand raised. "Sir, you can't be in here." The guard's voice faltered. His eyes glazed over. "I sleep in the storage closet on the night shift," he muttered. "My wife kicked me out. I tell everyone I'm working doubles." Darius walked past him to the bank of elevators. He pressed the button for the top floor. The other people waiting for the elevator shuffled away, a silent, fearful bubble forming around him. When the doors dinged open, he stepped in alone. The elevator rose. With each floor, the pressure built. He could feel the building around him, a Tower of Babel built on lies. Fraudulent reports, embezzled funds, sabotaged careers, hollow marriages conducted over conference calls. The horns were singing with it, a high, thin whine of anticipation. The doors opened onto the executive floor. Plush carpet, silent air conditioning. A receptionist with a face of frozen panic. A man in a corner office, the one with the best view, was on the phone. He saw Darius through the glass wall. He dropped the phone. He did not wait for the pressure to build. It was as if the truth had been waiting for this moment, a coiled spring finally released. "It's all a house of cards," the CEO said, his voice carrying through the quiet floor. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular. He was just stating a fact. "The company is insolvent. I've been moving money for years. I was going to announce a merger next week. It's a fiction. All of it." The floor erupted. Phones rang. People screamed. Darius turned and walked back to the elevator. His work here was done. The specific truth of one man had just unraveled the lies of thousands. He descended and walked back out into the day. The city was now buzzing with a different kind of energy. A raw, chaotic, truthful panic. He had not come to save it. He had come to make it real. He walked until the skyscrapers began to thin, replaced by warehouses and train yards. He felt no closer to an end, no closer to an understanding of his own origin. He was a force, and a force does not question its own existence. It simply is. A train was pulling out of a yard, its cars clanking together in a slow, rhythmic chain. He did not alter his pace. He walked alongside it then, with an easy, unnatural grace. He reached out and pulled himself onto a ladder between two freight cars. He found a small recess and sat, the city sprawling behind him, a monument to the chaos he had seeded. The train gathered speed, heading for open country, for the next town, the next city. The wind whipped at his face, but it was just wind. It carried no secrets, only the scent of distance. He closed his eyes. The horns were quiet for now, sated, but he knew their hunger would return. It always did, and he would be there to feed it. Story 2. It began not with a sight or a sound, but with a temperature. I was in my kitchen, scraping the burnt crust of a frozen pizza into the sink, when a pocket of air around me turned to ice. It was not the general chill of a faulty furnace or an open window in October. This was a localized winter, a perfect sphere of absolute zero that enveloped me from the waist up. My breath plumed in the lamplight, a tiny shocked cloud in the warm, greasy air of my own apartment. The hairs on my arms stood erect, and for 3 heartbeats, my teeth wanted to chatter. Then, as suddenly as it had descended, the cold was gone. The air returned to room temperature, leaving only the memory of that impossible chill seared into my skin, a ghost of a sensation that lingered for hours. I told myself it was a draft. I told myself it was stress. My life, up until that moment, had been a study in pleasant, unremarkable averages. I was Mariah, 24, working a data entry job that paid the rent on this 1-bedroom box and kept me in coffee and comfort food. I had friends, a few, the loyal kind. Ben, with his steady hands and his quiet engineering mind, and Chloe, who saw art in everything and painted with a fury that sometimes scared me. We were a triangle of normalcy, or so I believed. But that cold spot was the first crack in the foundation of my world, a tiny hairline fracture through which something else began to seep. The omens accumulated like dust in a neglected room. A week after the cold, I saw my reflection blink in a department store mirror. I was alone in the aisle, surrounded by garish red sales signs, and my own face in the glass winked at me slowly, deliberately, a fraction of a second after I had finished blinking myself. I froze, my hand halfway to a discounted blouse. The reflection smiled then, a small, secretive curl of the lips that was utterly foreign to me. I stumbled back, knocking over a rack of scarves. And when I looked again, it was just me, pale and wide-eyed, my own familiar fear staring back. I told Ben and Chloe that night, huddled in my apartment with the curtains drawn. The pizza felt like a lifetime ago. Ben listened, his brow furrowed in that way it did when he was assembling a problem in his mind, looking for the loose wire, the logical flaw. Trick of the light, Mariah. You were tired, stressed. Chloe said nothing, just watched me, her artist's eyes missing nothing. The tremor in my hands, the way my gaze kept darting to the windows, as if expecting to see someone standing on the 3rd floor fire escape. Then came the smells. The scent of old books and damp soil would fill my car on the drive home from work. The coppery tang of blood would bloom in my mouth while I was brushing my teeth. And the sounds, the worst of all, were the whispers. Not in my ears, but in the spaces between sounds, in the hum of the refrigerator, the drip of the faucet. They were just below the threshold of language, a sibilant rustle that seemed to be stitching together a story meant only for me. The breaking point, the moment the omens solidified into a presence, was on a Tuesday. I was walking home from the bus stop, the autumn leaves skittering like dry bones across the pavement. A man was walking toward me. An ordinary man in a beige coat, his head down against the wind. As he passed, his shoulder brushed mine. It was a casual city contact, but a jolt, like static electricity, amplified 1,000 times, shot up my arm. And he spoke, his voice a perfect imitation of my father's, who had been dead for 5 years. "It's almost time, sweetheart," the man said, without breaking stride or even looking at me. I ran. I ran until my lungs were strips of burning leather, bursting into my apartment and slamming the deadbolt home. I called Ben, my words a frantic, sobbing jumble. He came over with Chloe. They found me curled on the kitchen floor, right where the cold had first found me. "It's not a ghost," I whispered, the truth of it coiling in my gut like a parasite. "It's something that wears people. It can be anyone." Chloe, ever practical in a crisis, made tea. Ben paced. "Okay," he said, finally stopping. "Let's say we believe you. What does it want?" "May," I said, the word simple and absolute. "It's a curse. It passes from one person to another through intimacy, through closeness, through trust. The person who had it before me, they must have passed it on to me. I didn't know how I knew this. The knowledge was just there, deposited in my mind like a black egg hatching its terrible truth. You can pass it on to someone else, someone you're close to. But if you don't, it comes for you. Slowly, inevitably, it walks you down. Pass it on." Ben's face was a mask of revulsion. "You mean condemn someone else to this? Or face it yourself?" Chloe said softly, her hand finding mine. Her touch was warm, human, a fleeting anchor. "That's the choice?" I nodded, tears finally breaking free. "It's getting closer, learning me. The man with my dad's voice. It's never been that clear before. We became a fortress then, the three of us. Ben installed new locks, a chain, a peephole with a fisheye lens that distorted the world outside into a bloated, alien landscape. Chloe stayed over, sleeping on my couch, her presence a buffer against the creeping dark. We tried to research, to find a pattern, a history. But this thing was a shadow in the records of the world. We found only fragments, echoes. A diary entry from a settler in the 1800s mentioning a mimic witch. A police report from the 1950s about a man who claimed his neighbor was impersonating his dead wife, only for the neighbor to be found, confused, miles away. These were the past victims, their fates serving as our only terrifying warnings. They all ended the same way. They vanished. The skeptical outsiders were the next circle of our hell. My boss, a man named Dave, whose world was spreadsheets and quarterly reports, called me in after my third no-call, no-show. I tried to explain, to condense the cosmic horror of my existence into a palatable excuse. His face cycled through concern, impatience, and finally, dismissive pity. "Mariah, we all get stressed. You need to see someone. A professional. Take a week. Get your head straight." He didn't believe a word. Why would he? His reality was one of solid things, of numbers that added up. Mine was now a haunted house, where the walls changed when I wasn't looking. The entity's visits became more brazen. It came as Chloe one evening, knocking on my door with her exact, rhythmic tap. But the Chloe on my doorstep was a fraction of a degree off. The smile was too wide, the eyes too still. "Let me in, Mariah," it said, its voice a perfect replica. I forgot my key. I had just spoken to the real Chloe on the phone. She was at her studio across town. I watched through the peephole as the thing that wore my friend's face stood there, patient, its smile not faltering for a full 10 minutes before it turned and walked away, its steps unnaturally synchronized. Another time, it was Ben. I heard his key in the lock. He had a spare for emergencies. The door opened and he walked in, carrying a bag of groceries. "Brought you some soup," he said. But Ben would never just walk in. He always knocked first. Always. I backed away, my hand closing around a heavy book on the coffee table. The Ben thing's expression shifted, the familiar lines of his face softening into something placid and utterly empty. "You're learning," it said, and its voice was no longer Ben's, but a flat, toneless thing, like stone grinding against stone. It left then, simply turning and walking out, leaving the bag of groceries on the floor. When the real Ben arrived 20 minutes later, we found the bag contained only a single raw turnip, caked in dark, moist soil. The climax was a symphony of terror conducted in the key of the mundane. It was a Thursday. Chloe was with me. Ben was on his way. The air in the apartment was thick and still. We were sitting in silence, the only sound the frantic scratching of Chloe's charcoal pencil as she furiously sketched nothing in particular, a nervous habit. Then the phone rang. The landline, an old cordless thing I kept for emergencies. The display showed Ben's cell number. I answered. "Ben? Mariah? Don't let her in." It was Ben's voice, tight with panic. "It's not Chloe with you. It's the thing. I'm outside. I can see it through the window. It's sitting right next to you. Get out. Now." My blood turned to ice. I looked at Chloe. She looked back, her eyes wide, her sketchbook falling from her lap. "What is it?" she whispered. The phone in my hand crackled. "Mariah, it's me. I'm downstairs. My key broke in the lock. Who were you talking to?" It was Ben's voice again, from the same phone. I dropped the handset as if it had burned me. Both voices had been perfect. Both had been him. I was trapped in a hall of mirrors, and every reflection was a lie. I looked from the phone on the floor to the Chloe across from me. Which was real? Was either of them real? The Chloe in front of me reached out a hand. "Mariah, it's okay. It's me, I promise." Her voice was trembling, her fear so palpable it felt authentic. Then the door handle jiggled. Not a knock, a jiggle. Then a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like a key being dragged across the metal. A voice, my mother's this time, sweet and concerned, called through the wood. "Honey, are you in there? Let me in. It's cold out here." I was hyperventilating, my vision spotting. The thing could be any of them. It could be both of them. It was the air itself, the silence. The very concept of trust turned against me. The curse required intimacy, and it had systematically destroyed every intimate connection I had, turning them into potential weapons. The scraping at the door stopped. A new sound began, a soft, wet, tearing sound coming from the hallway, and a smell bloomed under the door, the smell of damp earth and rotting pages. The Chloe in my apartment stood up, her face blank. "It's tired of waiting," she said, and her voice was the toneless, grinding stone. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran to the door and threw it open, not to flee, but to confront the source of the sound. The hallway was empty, but the sound was louder now, coming from the stairwell. I descended, step by step, my heart a wild drum in my chest. The lobby was empty. The front door of the building was standing open, letting in the cold night air. And there, standing under the yellow glow of a street lamp, was Ben. He saw me, his face a mixture of relief and terror. "Mariah, thank God. My phone died. What's happening?" I walked towards him, my body moving as if through deep water. I was within 10 feet of him when I saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible thing. A single, dead leaf was caught in the laces of his left shoe. A leaf identical to the ones from the tree outside my apartment window. A tree whose branches did not reach the street where he supposedly was. He was not Ben. He smiled, and it was a perfect imitation of his relieved smile. But I saw the emptiness behind it now, the vast, ancient patience in eyes that were not his eyes. It had won. It had cornered me not with a monster's face, but with the face of the person I trusted most. "It's over, Mariah," the Ben thing said, taking a step toward me. And in that moment I made my choice. I would not be walked down. I would not vanish. The curse demanded intimacy. It demanded a passing of the torch. And as it reached for me, I did not run. I stepped forward. I reached out and I grabbed its wrist. The contact was like gripping frozen lightning. A torrent of images, of memories not my own, flooded into me. 1,000 faces, 1,000 lives, all ending in that same terrible, patient gaze. I focused everything I had, every ounce of my fear and my love and my betrayal. And I pushed it all back down, that connection. Not to destroy it, but to transfer it. I pushed the curse into the thing that wore Ben's face. Its smile vanished. The Ben shape shuddered, its form flickering for a split second, revealing something thin and stretched and impossibly old beneath. A sound like a mountain sighing escaped its lips. Then it turned and walked away, down the street, dissolving into the shadows between the street lamps. I stood there, shaking, the ghost of that cold touch on my hand. I was free, but the cost of that freedom was a new, heavier chill that had taken root in my soul. I had passed it on. I had used the only intimacy left to me, the intimate knowledge of its own nature, to force the transfer. I had saved myself and condemned the entity to its own endless hunt. Or so I thought. Weeks passed. The world returned to its normal colors. The whispers stopped. The smells faded. Ben and Chloe, the real Ben and Chloe, stayed close. A fragile normalcy rebuilding itself around us. We never spoke of it in detail. It was a wound we let scar over. I am in my new kitchen now in a new city, 1,000 miles from that street lamp. The sun is bright outside. I am making a cup of tea, the kettle whistling a cheerful domestic tune. The steam rises in a warm, moist cloud. And then, a pocket of air around me turns to ice. It is a perfect sphere of absolute zero, enveloping me from the waist up. My breath plumes in the sunlight. The whistle of the kettle seems to distort, stretching into a long, familiar, toneless sound, like stone grinding against stone. I stand perfectly still, the chill seeping not into my skin, but into the very core of who I am. I understand now. The curse was not a chain that could be broken by passing a link. It was a circle, a loop. And in my moment of ultimate intimacy with the thing, my violent, desperate transfer of its essence, I had not passed it on. I had welcomed it in. I had become the new home for the ancient, patient thing. It is not pursuing me anymore. It is waiting within me. And soon, it will be time to find someone new. The chill is not a warning. It is a reminder. It is my inheritance. The knowledge settles in my stomach like a lead weight. I do not scream. I do not panic. A profound and terrible calm descends upon me. This is how it must have felt for all the others, the ones in the diaries and the police reports. This moment of understanding that the fight was never about winning, only about delaying the inevitable transformation. I finish making the tea. My hands are steady. The steam from the cup rises into the now warm air, a mockery of my frozen breath from moments before. I carry it to the small table by the window and sit down. The sun is still bright. Children are playing in the park across the street. Their laughter is a sharp, distant sound, like something happening in another universe. I look at my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. My own face looks back, pale but composed. Is it still me in there? I search my own eyes for a flicker of that ancient emptiness, for the placid patience of the thing that wore Ben's face. I see only my own fear, my own resignation. For now, the plan begins to form not as a conscious thought, but as an instinct, rising from a place deep inside that is no longer entirely my own. It is a cold, pragmatic blueprint. I must isolate myself. Ben and Chloe cannot be near me now. Their trust, their love, is the weapon I will be forced to use. The curse requires intimacy, and I will starve it. I will become an island. I send a text to the group chat we share. Need some space for a bit. Going off-grid. Don't worry. I love you both. I turn off my phone before their replies can flood in. Their concern will be a siren song, and I cannot afford to listen. Days turn into a week. I leave my apartment only for necessities, moving through the world like a ghost. I speak to no one. I avoid eye contact. I feel it inside me, a silent passenger, learning the new vessel. Sometimes, when I pass a mirror, my reflection seems to hold my gaze a second too long. Sometimes, my own hand, reaching for a can of soup, will feel alien, as if its movements are not entirely my own. The loneliness is a physical ache, a hollowed-out feeling that the thing inside me seems to feed upon. It is patient. It knows I cannot keep this up forever. The human need for connection is its greatest ally. The breaking point comes in a supermarket. I am in the checkout line, staring blankly at the tabloid headlines. A man in front of me, older, with kind eyes and a worn wedding ring, struggles to lift his grocery bag. Without thinking, my hand darts out to steady it. "Thank you, dear," he says, his voice warm and grandfatherly. A jolt, like a static shock, passes from his hand to mine. It is the same feeling I felt when I touched the Ben thing. The man's smile falters for a microsecond. His eyes glaze over, and in that instant, I see not him, but the entity looking out through his eyes, recognizing its own. Then the moment passes. He is just a kind old man again, nodding his thanks and shuffling away. I stand frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. It is testing me. It is using my own involuntary kindness as a conduit. It is showing me that any connection, no matter how small, is a potential doorway. I abandon my cart and hurry home, locking the door behind me. I lean against it, breathing heavily. The cold spot in the kitchen was the beginning. This is the middle. The end is a foregone conclusion. I cannot live like this in a prison of my own making, waiting for the thing to force my hand. I look around my sterile, silent apartment. I think of Ben's steady hands and Chloe's fierce loyalty. I think of the man in the supermarket, his simple human decency. I cannot condemn any of them, but the urge is there, a whispering temptation in the back of my mind. It would be so easy. A conversation with Chloe, a hug from Ben, a moment of true closeness, and I could be free of this weight. I could pass this torment on and walk away into the sunlight, just as I thought I had before. The whisper is seductive, and it sounds like my own voice. It is the most terrifying thing I have ever heard. The fight is no longer against a monster at my door. The fight is against the monster I am becoming, and I am no longer sure which one of us is going to win. The silence in the apartment was no longer empty. It was a presence, a listener. I could feel it evaluating my thoughts, my resolve. The temptation to call Ben, to hear his voice, was a physical craving. I knew that if I did, my own voice would betray me, luring him here with a vulnerability that was both real and manufactured. The thing inside me would use my genuine love as bait. I had to make a choice that was not a choice. I could not live as a hermit, and I would not live as a predator. There was a third option, the one I had found in the fragments of history. The victims always vanished. They didn't just die, they were taken, absorbed. What if that was the only true escape? Not to pass the curse on, but to take it with me, into whatever nothingness awaited. The plan was simple, and it felt less like my own and more like a script that had been waiting for me. I would go to a place of absolute solitude, a place with no one to touch, no one to trust, no one to betray. I would let the thing have me completely, without a new host to jump to. I would break the cycle by refusing to spin it further. I packed a bag with a few supplies, watered or dart, a knife, not for the thing, but for the practicalities of the wild. I drove north for hours, leaving the city and its lights far behind, until the roads turned to gravel and then to dirt tracks. I parked the car at the end of a logging road and walked into the deep woods, following no path. The forest was dense and ancient. The air was clean and cold, smelling of pine and decay. For the first time in weeks, the pressure in my chest eased. Here, there was no one. The entity was quiet inside me, perhaps curious, perhaps wary of this new, desolate strategy. I found a small, rocky clearing by a stream and dropped my pack. This was the place. As night fell, I built a small fire, its crackling defiance a tiny challenge to the immense dark. I sat before it, waiting. It started not as an external force, but as an internal unraveling. My memories began to feel thin, like pages in a book someone else was reading. The face of my mother blurred. The sound of Ben's laughter became an echo without a source. I was being hollowed out, my life repurposed as fuel for the thing that wore me. A figure emerged from the trees. It was my father again, but his form was wavering, insubstantial. "This is a pointless gesture, Mariah," he said, his voice layered with the echoes of 1,000 other voices. "We are patient. We can wait here within you until you are found, or until you break and return to the world." "I'm not going back," I said, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the woods. "Then we will simply take," it replied. The figure of my father dissolved, and for a moment I saw the true form. A shifting, man-shaped void, a hole in the world where a person should be. It was made of absence, of stolen identities. It moved toward me, not walking, but flowing like smoke. The fire guttered and nearly died. The cold was not of this world. It was the cold of deep space, of absolute negation. This was not an attack. It was a claiming. As it reached for me, I did not fight. I closed my eyes and thought of Chloe's hand finding mine on the kitchen floor. I held on to that single warm memory, a pebble of truth in an ocean of lies. I felt the void envelop me, seeping into my mind, my soul. It was a vast, silent, hungry thing, an intelligence that had forgotten its own origin, knowing only the endless cycle of the hunt. I felt myself dissolving, my thoughts scattering like dust in a wind. The memory of Chloe's hand began to fade. I was almost gone. And then something shifted. The entity recoiled. It was a violent, startled motion, a wave of confusion that originated from its very core. The void that was consuming me seemed to convulse. In that final moment of my consciousness, as I huddled around the last ember of who I was, I understood. It had never been alone in here with me. I had been carrying the curse, yes, but I had also been carrying the cumulative resistance of every soul it had ever consumed. Their struggles, their love, their refusal to completely vanish. It was all still in here, buried in the thing's essence. My final, selfless act, my refusal to pass on the torment had been a key. It had resonated with all those lost voices, amplifying them into a single deafening shout of "no doughty way." The void shrieked, a soundless tearing at the fabric of reality. It could not hold this much light, this much collective will. It was a parasite that had finally taken a poison host. The last thing I felt was not an end, but a shattering, a release. I opened my eyes. I was lying on the ground by the stream. The fire was ashes. The sun was rising. I was cold, terribly cold, but it was the normal cold of a night spent in the woods. I felt empty, clean. The oppressive presence was gone. The whispering temptation in my mind was silent. I sat up, my body aching. I looked at my hands, turning them over in the dawnlight. They were just my hands. I tentatively reached for the memory of my father's face. It was there, clear and sharp, filled with my own love and grief, not its imitation. I thought of Ben and Chloe, and felt only a warm, human longing. I had won, not by destroying it, but by overloading it with the one thing it could not process, a final, willing sacrifice. I had offered it myself, and in doing so, I had given a voice to every self it had ever stolen. It was gone. I stood up, weak and trembling, and began the long walk back to the car, back to the world. The woods were just woods now. The shadows were just shadows. The curse was broken. I was free. And as I walked, I began to remember not just my own life, but fleeting, dreamlike fragments of other lives, other faces, all finally at peace. They were not a weight inside me anymore. They were a quiet, grateful memory. I was not just Mariah anymore. I was their monument, and I was going home. The walk out of the woods felt longer than the walk in. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, made me flinch, expecting the familiar chill, the toneless voice. But nothing came. The world remained stubbornly, blessedly, normal. When I reached my car, the morning sun was warm on the metal. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just breathing, feeling the solidity of the steering wheel under my hands. The drive back to the city was a blur. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the entity to reveal that this was just another layer of its cruel game. But the silence inside my head held. It was my own silence. I didn't go to my apartment. I drove straight to Ben's. He opened the door before I could even knock, his face etched with a week's worth of worry. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, really looked. And then he pulled me into a fierce, crushing hug. I buried my face in his shoulder and breathed in the scent of his laundry detergent and his skin. It was just him. There was no void behind his eyes, no ancient patience. Just Ben. Chloe arrived 20 minutes later, her eyes red-rimmed. She hugged me too, and we sat on Ben's couch, a tangle of limbs and relief. I didn't tell them everything. I couldn't. The words for what had happened in the woods didn't exist. I told them I had been lost, that I'd faced something terrible, and that it was over. They accepted it. Their trust, which had once felt like a weapon, now felt like a blanket, warming the parts of me that were still frozen. Life began again. True life, not the performance I had been maintaining. I moved in with Ben. We got a dog, a clumsy golden retriever puppy. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since before the curse began. The colors were vibrant, almost painfully so. I was learning to live in a world without a constant, lurking dread. But the past is not a country you can simply leave. It follows you in the weather of your mind. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I would wake up and the room would feel too cold. I would lie there, rigid, waiting for the grinding stone voice, for the smell of damp earth. It never came. It was just the old house, the open window, the memory of fear. The fragments of other lives stayed with me, not as voices, but as instincts. I would suddenly know how to fix a watch, a skill I had never learned. I would hum a lullaby in a language I didn't recognize. Ben would find me staring at a particular type of flower in the garden with a profound, unaccountable sadness in my eyes. I was a mosaic now, pieced together with shards of the people the entity had consumed. Their peace was my peace, but their memories were my ghosts. One afternoon, I was at the grocery store. The same chain, a different city. I was reaching for a box of pasta when I saw her. A woman, maybe a few years younger than me, standing frozen in the middle of the aisle. Her eyes were wide with a familiar, hunted terror. She was staring at a man further down the aisle, her husband perhaps, as he examined a jar of sauce. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her cart. Our eyes met. In her gaze, I saw the same hypervigilance, the same paranoia that had been my constant companion. I saw the fear that the person you love most might not be who you think they are. The curse was gone. I was sure of it. But the world is a big place, and old, hungry things have a way of persisting in different forms, of finding new cracks to seep into. She looked at me, a silent plea for confirmation, for a sign that she wasn't insane. I held her gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. It wasn't a gesture of dismissal, but of warning. A signal passed between two survivors in an invisible war. I turned and walked away, my heart aching for her. I had my own life to live, my own hard-won peace to protect. I was free, but as I pushed my cart toward the checkout, the sunlight streaming through the window seemed for a moment to dim. And the chill I felt was not from the air conditioning. It was the chill of knowing that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. And that while I had broken one circle, the world was full of others. I paid for my groceries and walked out into the parking lot. The sun was bright, but the image of the woman's terrified face was seared onto the back of my eyelids. I had done the right thing. I had to believe that. To get involved, to try and explain, would have been to step back into a world I had barely escaped. It would have risked everything Ben and I had built. When I got home, Ben was in the backyard, throwing a ball for the dog. The scene was so normal, so perfect. It felt like a shield against the darkness I had just glimpsed. I stood at the window and watched them, letting the simple joy of the moment soak into me. This was my life now. This was what I had fought for. But a seed of doubt had been planted. The entity was gone, but its echo remained, not just in my fragmented memories, but in the world. I had assumed my victory was absolute, a final slaying of a singular monster. What if it wasn't? What if it was just one branch of a creeping, ancient vine? The thought was insidious, a slow-acting poison in my newfound peace. That night, I dreamed not of the void, but of a vast, dark forest. I was walking on a path, and from the trees on either side, I could hear whispers. They were not threatening. They were calling for help. I saw the woman from the grocery store, her form flickering between the pines. I saw others, faces I half recognized from my time as a vessel. They were lost, and they were looking to me, the one who had gotten out, to show them the way. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. Ben slept soundly beside me. The dream felt less like a nightmare, and more like a message, a responsibility. The next morning, I went up into the attic and found the box where I had stored all my research from before. The diaries, the photocopied police reports. I had wanted to burn it all, to purge every reminder. Now, I carried the box down to the kitchen table. Ben came in, holding his coffee mug, and stopped when he saw the spread of papers. "Mariah," he asked, his voice gentle but laced with concern. "What are you doing?" I looked up at him, at his good and honest face. "I saw something yesterday," I said. "Or someone. I think I might be able to help." He sat down slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. He didn't tell me it was a bad idea. He didn't tell me to let it go. He just listened as I explained about the woman, about the dream, about the terrible dawning realization that my freedom might have come with a price. That I had been left with a map of the labyrinth, and now people were getting lost inside it. "It's not your job to save everyone," he said finally, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I know," I replied, lacing my fingers with his. His touch was still a miracle, but it's my choice. I can't unknow what I know. I can't unsee what I've seen. He squeezed my hand. "Then we'll figure it out. Together. We?" The word was an anchor. I wasn't alone in this. The isolation that the curse demanded had been its greatest strength. But my connection to Ben, to Chloe, to the world, was my strength. It was what had ultimately broken the cycle. I opened the first diary, its pages brittle and yellowed. I was not reading it as a victim anymore, searching for a way out. I was reading it as a scholar, as a hunter of a different kind. I was looking for patterns, for points of origin, for others who might have survived. The entity was gone, but the conditions that allowed it to exist were still out there. The loneliness, the despair, the cracks in a person's life that such a thing could slither into. I wasn't just a monument to the lost anymore. I was a guide, and I had work to do. The fight was different now, but it was still a fight. This time, however, I would not be fighting in the dark. I would be fighting for the light I had found, and for the chance to lead others back to it. The research was slow, painstaking work. The diaries were a morass of paranoia and half-truths. But now, with the clarity of distance, I could separate the human fear from the entity's influence. I started to see a pattern emerge, not in the symptoms, but in the circumstances. The victims were always isolated, often grieving, their social ties frayed or severed. The entity was a predator that hunted the lonely. Ben helped me set up a database, cross-referencing dates and locations with news reports of missing persons and sudden inexplicable acts of violence. Chloe, with her fierce loyalty, became our field researcher, using her journalistic skills to dig into cold cases. We were a quiet, determined team, operating from our kitchen table, a dog sleeping at our feet. It was Chloe who found the first solid link. A man in a town 2 states over had recently been committed after attacking his brother, claiming he was an imposter. The details were eerily familiar. The sudden shift in personality, the targeted paranoia, the chilling calm that followed the initial outburst. According to the local paper, he had been a recluse for months after the death of his wife. "We have to go," I said, looking from Ben to Chloe. Ben's expression was grim. "And do what, Mariah? Walk into a psychiatric ward and tell him we think he's possessed by an ancient, body-snatching entity?" "No," I said, the plan forming as I spoke. "We tell him we believe him." The drive was long and quiet. The psychiatric facility was a low, modern building that tried too hard to be welcoming. The air inside smelled of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. We were led to a visiting room, and a few minutes later, the orderly brought in a haggard man with hollow eyes. This was Leo. He looked at the 3 of us with open suspicion. "Who are you?" I leaned forward, keeping my voice low and steady. "My name is Mariah. I think something is pretending to be your brother." His eyes widened, a flicker of desperate hope amidst the exhaustion. You see it too?" "I don't see it in your brother," I said. "But I felt what you're feeling. The dread. The certainty that the person you love is gone, replaced by something that wears their face." Tears welled in his eyes. They think I'm crazy." "I know. They thought I was crazy too." I didn't break eye contact. "The thing you're fighting, it feeds on isolation. It wants you to be alone, It wants you to think no one will ever believe you. So what do? He whispered, his voice cracking. You fight it by remembering, I said. You hold on to the real memories. The good ones, the true ones. You hold on so tight that it can't take them from you. And you remember that you are not alone. I reached into my bag and slid a small, smooth stone across the table to him. It was just a river stone, gray and unremarkable. When the fear gets too loud, hold this. Feel how solid it is. That's real. You are real. You're real. Your love for your wife was real. That thing is not. He picked up the stone, clutching it in his fist like a lifeline. It was a simple, silly gesture, but I saw a shift in his posture. The sheer, crushing loneliness had been punctured. Someone had come. Someone had believed him. We didn't perform an exorcism. We didn't break him out. We just sat with him for an hour, talking about his wife, about his life before the darkness fell. We were anchor in his storm. As we left, he looked at me. And for the first time, there was a spark of something other than terror in his eyes. It was resolve. In the car on the way home, Chloe broke the silence. Do you think it will work? Will he get better? I don't know, I admitted, watching the landscape blur past. But we showed him he isn't fighting it alone. That changes everything. The entity was gone from me, but its legacy of isolation remained. My new purpose was not to hunt monsters, but to build bridges. To reach out a hand to those who were where I'd been, trapped in a prison of their own making, convinced that the end was a foregone conclusion. I had walked out of the woods, but there were others still lost in the trees, and I would keep walking back in as long as it took to lead them out. Story 3. The box was in the corner of my study, tucked between a filing cabinet I never used and the wall. A cube of dark, oil-rubbed oak that seemed to drink the light from the single lamp on my desk. It was not large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, but it had a density to it, a gravitational pull that went beyond its physical weight. I had placed it there myself, years ago, with the specific intention of forgetting it. The dust was its shroud, a soft gray fur that coated the lid and filled the intricate carvings I could no longer bear to look at. I had been successful in my forgetting until today. Today, my eyes, wandering from the empty white page on my screen, had snagged on it, and the forgetting was over. Its name was Silas. Not a name I chose with any great deliberation, but one that rose from the silt of my subconscious, fully formed and tasting of iron and old stone. He was the engine of my first 3 novels, the razor's edge that made Leroy Ketchum a name whispered in certain literary circles, with a mixture of admiration and unease. He was the man who did the things my protagonist, a weary detective named Alonso, could not. He was the necessary darkness, the ID made flesh and set loose upon the page. He inked a world of its filth with a butcher's precision, and my readers devoured it. They called it gritty. They called it real. I called it a exorcism, a way to drain the black water that sometimes pooled in the basement of my own soul. The box contained his relics. Not his, of course, but the things I had used to conjure him. A river-smooth stone, cold as a dead man's eye. A lock of hair, dark and coarse. That was not mine. A photograph of a stranger, torn from a newspaper. A man with a face so bland it was a canvas. And a key, a heavy, old-fashioned thing, its teeth worn down, that unlocked nothing I had ever found in the waking world. These were my totems. I would lay them out on my desk, run my fingers over them, and sink into the warm, dark waters of him. The words would come then, not as sentences constructed, but as visions transcribed. The sound of a rib cage giving way. The smell of ozone and copper. The feeling of absolute, unassailable power. I stopped writing about Silas 5 years ago. I married Josephine. I moved to this quiet house at the end of a lane curtained by weeping willows. I wrote a novel about a gardener rediscovering joy. It was a critical and commercial failure, a pale, bloodless thing. My editor was polite, my agent concerned. The black water in my basement was rising, and I had thrown away the pump. The crimes began 3 months ago. A man named Arthur Pims, a loan shark with a reputation for breaking knees, was found in his own warehouse. The official report said bludgeoning. The unofficial details, whispered by Alonso over a beer at a bar far from his precinct, were more specific. Every major bone, from his fingers to his jaw, had been meticulously shattered. It was, Alonso said, like he had been used as a percussion instrument. There was a symbol carved into his forehead, a thing of angles and loops that meant nothing to anyone. It meant something to me. I had drawn it on a notepad, over and over, while writing the third Silas novel. It was his mark. I told myself it was a copycat, a sick, devoted fan. The thought was a flimsy raft on a rising sea. Then came the second. A woman, a known poisoner who had walked on a technicality, was discovered in her pristine suburban kitchen. She had been forced to consume every cleaning agent under her sink. The symbol was carved into her linoleum floor. The third was a corrupt city councilman. He was found in his campaign office, drowned in a water cooler. The symbol was drawn on the wall in the water that had spilled. Alonso started coming by the house more often. Not as a friend, but as a detective. His questions were soft, polite, but his eyes were hard. He had read my books. He knew about Silas. He noticed the way my hand shook when I poured his coffee. "It's uncanny, Leroy," he'd say, stirring his cup slowly. "The details, the little things we never release to the press. It's like the killer is working from a script, your script." Josephine sensed the change in me. The sleepless nights I spent staring out the window into the swallowing dark of the willows. The way I jumped at the settling sounds of the old house. She would lay a cool hand on my forehead and whisper, "You're working too hard, my love. Come to bed." But I wasn't working at all. The white page on my screen remained white. The only thing growing was the fear, a cold, fibrous root coiling around my spine. One evening I came home to find the study door ajar. I always kept it locked. A simple, foolish habit. A holdover from the old days when I didn't want to be disturbed during my descent. My blood turned to ice water. I pushed the door open. The room was dark. The only light the deep blue of twilight through the window. Josephine was standing by my desk. She was holding the oak box. The lid was open. "What is this, Leroy?" Her voice was small, distant. "It feels old and wrong." I snatched it from her. My heart was a frantic bird beating against my ribs. "It's nothing. Research for an old book." The lie was brittle and sharp in my mouth. She looked at me, her eyes wide and wounded. "It smells like rust," she said, and left the room. That night, I dreamt of Silas, not as words on a page, but as a presence. He was standing at the foot of my bed, a silhouette cut from a deeper darkness than the room could provide. I could not see his face, but I could feel his satisfaction, a palpable heat radiating from him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The message was clear. The leash is off. The next morning, I took the box. I carried it out to the woods behind our property, to a small, stagnant creek that never saw the sun. I intended to throw it in to let the water and the mud claim it. But as I stood on the bank, the box in my hands, I couldn't do it. It felt like trying to throw away my own shadow. It was a part of me. The worst part, perhaps, but a part nonetheless. I hid it under a rotten log instead, covering it with leaves and loam. A temporary measure. A child's solution. When I returned to the house, breathless and smeared with dirt, Alonso's car was in the driveway. He was waiting for me on the porch, his face grim. "There's been another one," he said, dispensing with any greeting. "Walter Frey Dart, a slumlord. Nasty piece of work. We found him in one of his own buildings. The place was condemned. No electricity, no running water. And I waited. The air was thick, difficult to breathe. He was sewn into the walls," Alonso said, his voice flat, professional. "Alive, we think, plastered over. We only found him because a neighbor reported a scratching sound for 2 days. My knees buckled. I had to grab the porch railing. The world tilted. And the symbol," I asked, though I already knew. "Carved into the plaster, right where his face would have been." Alonso took a step closer. He was a big man, and his presence suddenly felt immense, crushing. "Leroy, I need you to come down to the station. I need to know everything. Every thought you ever had about this." Silas. I went. I sat in a cold, gray room and I talked. I told him about the totems, the rituals, the feeling of becoming another person. I told him it was just fiction. I was a writer, not a killer. He listened, his eyes never leaving my face. He didn't believe me. I could see it. He thought I was a brilliant madman, so lost in my own fantasy that I had begun to live it. In a way, he was right. They let me go. There was no evidence. Nothing but a pattern that lived in my books and in my head. When I got home, the house was silent. Too silent. "Josephine." I called out. No answer. A trail of wet, muddy footprints led from the back door, through the kitchen, and down the hall toward my study. They were not my footprints. They were larger, bare, and the mud was the same black loam from the creek bank. My heart stopped. Then it started again. A single, painful hammer blow. I followed the prints. They ended at the door, to my study. The door was closed. From the other side I could hear a sound. A soft, rhythmic scratching, like a fingernail on wood. I pushed the door open. He was sitting in my chair, his back to me, looking out the window at the gathering night. He was tall, broader than me, dressed in dark, nondescript clothes that were damp and streaked with dirt. The air in the room was frigid and carried the smell of the creek, of stagnant water, of decay, of wet earth. He did not turn. On my desk, arranged with a terrible care, were the totems from the box. The stone, the lock of hair, the photograph, their key. "Josephine?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "She is safe," the man said. His voice was not what I had imagined. It was not a gravelly monster's growl. It was my own voice, but filtered through stone, stripped of all hesitation, all warmth, all fear. It was the voice I heard in my head when the words were coming fast and dark. "For now, she's part of the pattern, the loyal wife, the catalyst. Her fear will be exquisite. Later. "Silas," I said. The name was a prayer and a curse. He swiveled the chair slowly to face me. It was my face. But it was my face as if drawn by a master artist who had understood the underlying architecture of all my weaknesses and had chiseled them away. The lines of anxiety around the mouth were gone. The slight uncertainty in the eyes was absent. This face was a mask of absolute serene conviction. The eyes were the worst. They were my shade of hazel, but they held no soul, only a vast, intelligent emptiness, like the deep sea. "You," I breathed. "We," he corrected. He stood up, and he was taller than me. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace I had only ever described. "You poured the water, I in the vessel. You cannot be surprised that it holds the shape you gave it. The killings. Our work, he said, spreading his hands. They were my hands, but the knuckles were scarred, the fingers strong. You defined the justice. I am merely its instrument. You grew tired, soft. You tried to bury me, but you cannot bury a shadow. You can only turn your back on it, and then it is always behind you. He took a step toward me. I backed away, hitting the door jamb. The fear was a physical thing, a chemical fire in my veins. What do you want? I begged. I want to finish the story, he said, his gaze drifting past me, down the hall toward where I knew Josephine was. The last chapter, the confrontation, the creator destroyed by his creation. It's a classic ending. A little trite, perhaps, but satisfying. He looked back at me, and for the first time, a smile touched his lips. It was my smile, but it was a ghastly parody, devoid of any humor or love. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the ending is more nuanced. Perhaps the creator and the creation become one. Perhaps Leroy Ketchum finally accepts the gift he has been given, the power to cleanse, to punish. He took another step. I could smell the iron on him now, beneath the creek smell, the iron of old blood. No, I whispered. Yes, he said, and his voice was a hypnotic drone, the voice I used to lull myself into the writing trance. It is the only way. You have been a ghost in your own life, Leroy. A passenger. Let me be the driver. Let me carry the weight. You can sleep. I will keep watch. I will take care of Josephine. I will be a better you. He was close enough to touch me. I could feel the cold radiating from his skin. He reached out a hand, not to strike me, but to touch my forehead. A benediction. I do not know what happened next. There was a blur of motion, a shout. Alonzo's voice, roaring from the hallway. Freeze! Get away from him! Silas turned, his movement a liquid blur. There was a flash of metal, the letter opener from my desk, now in his hand. A gunshot, deafening in the small room. Alonzo fired. Silas did not flinch. He moved forward. Another shot. And another. I saw Alonzo fall, a dark flower blooming on his chest. Silas stood over him, then looked back at me. A minor character. His purpose is served. He walked toward me again. There was no hurry in him. He was the inevitable conclusion. I closed my eyes. I could not fight him. He was everything I had ever feared I was, given form and purpose. He was my anger, my pride, my darkness. He was stronger than me. His cold hand touched my cheek. And then, a sound. A soft, broken sob from the hallway. Josephine Dowett. She was standing there, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was meant for me. In that moment, I saw myself through her eyes. I saw the monster I had become, the monster I had always carried. I opened my eyes and looked at Silas. I looked into that perfect empty face, and I did the only thing I had the power to do. I stopped believing in him. I took a deep, shuddering breath, and I let go of the story. I let go of the anger, the self-loathing, the need for a darkness to blame for the darkness inside me. I uncreated him. He faltered. The absolute certainty in his eyes flickered. The solidity of his form seemed to waver, like a heat haze on a summer road. No, he whispered, and for the first time, there was something in his voice, not fear, but confusion. The confusion of a character who realizes the author has abandoned a page. He reached for me, but his hand passed through my shoulder, a sensation of intense cold and static. He looked down at his own hands, which were becoming translucent. The smell of the creek faded. The iron scent, vanished. He was dissolving, not with a scream, but with a sigh. A long, slow exhalation of nothingness. The last thing to go were his eyes, my eyes, fixed on me with a look of profound cosmic betrayal. And then he was gone. The room was just a room. The only smell was dust and gunpowder. Alonzo was dead on the floor. Josephine was weeping in the hallway. I fell to my knees. The police came. There was an investigation. They could not explain it. A seasoned detective, dead from his own gunshots, in the study of a famous novelist. There was no other assailant. No evidence of one. The forensics team found traces of creek mud, but I had tracked that in. They found the oak box, empty, where I had hidden it. They called it a tragedy, a mental break. They left, their questions unanswered, their files forever open. I never wrote another word. Josephine stayed, but a part of her is always watching me. A faint, unanswerable question in her eyes. We never speak of that night. We live in the quiet house at the end of the lane. The willows weep outside our window. Sometimes, in the deep silence of the night, I wake from a dream I cannot remember. The room is cold. And for a fleeting second, just before I open my eyes, I have the sensation that I am not alone in my skin. That another consciousness, cold and patient and utterly sure, is sleeping there. Curled in the marrow of my bones, waiting for me to pick up a pen, to dream him back into the world, waiting for the story to begin again. And then I open my eyes. The room is empty. The page is white. And the only thing I can remember is the dust, settling softly in the corner of the study, on a spot where a box once sat, as if the whole terrible, beautiful dream was nothing more than a forgotten detail. The dust, I have come to understand, is the true antagonist of my life now. It is patient. It always returns. I watch it gather on the shelves, on the picture frames, on the silent, dark screen of my computer. Josephine dusts on Tuesdays, her movements efficient and quiet. But by Thursday, a fine gray film has already begun to reclaim every surface. It is a kind of forgetting, and I am grateful for it. We have a routine, Josephine and I. We drink our coffee in the morning on the porch, watching the willows shift in the breeze. We tend to the garden, though my efforts are clumsy and she often has to rescue the plants I have overwatered or neglected. We do not talk about the books. We do not talk about Alonso. We have built a life on the foundation of that silence, and it is, for the most part, sturdy. But the silence has a texture. It is not an empty silence. It is a listening one. Last Tuesday, I found a single dead crow on the back step. Its neck was broken. It was placed with a deliberate neatness, its wings tucked tight against its body. There was no blood. I disposed of it before Josephine saw, my hands shaking as I dug a small hole under the willow tree. I told myself it was a cat, a fuck. The world is full of small, random cruelties. Then, this morning, the mail came. Among the bills and catalogs was a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single, glossy photograph. It was a picture of a brick wall, old and stained with damp. In the center of the wall, scratched into the mortar with something sharp, was the symbol. The angles and loops were unmistakable. It was fresher, less a carving and more a desperate gouge. There was no note, no context, just the image, screaming in its silence. I stood in the kitchen, the photograph pinched between my fingers, and felt the cold seeping back into the house. It started in my feet, a deep, penetrating chill that climbed up my legs and settled in my chest. Josephine was humming in the next room. The sound was like a distant bell, a call from a world I was suddenly shut out of. I did not show her the photograph. I burned it in the sink, watching the edges curl and blacken, the symbol writhing in the flame before it vanished into ash. I washed the residue down the drain. A child's solution. But the cold remained. That night, I dreamt not of Silas, but of writing. The dream was visceral, tactile. I felt the weight of a pen in my hand, the smooth glide of ink across paper. I was not writing words. I was drawing the symbol, over and over, each iteration more precise, more charged with meaning. I woke with a start, my right hand cramped into a claw, the phantom sensation of ink staining my fingers. The study is kept locked now. The key is buried in the garden. But this afternoon, driven by a compulsion I could not name, I dug it up. The metal was cold and gritty in my palm. I unlocked the door. The room was exactly as I had left it years ago, a museum of a forgotten life. The air was thick and still. I went to the desk. I opened the bottom drawer, the one I had not touched since that night. It was supposed to be empty, but it was not. Lying in the very back of the drawer was a river-smooth stone, cold as a dead man's eye. I did not put it there. Josephine would never. I picked it up. The cold from the stone seeped into my palm. A familiar, dreadful comfort. And for the first time in years, a sentence formed in my mind. Unbidden, fully formed. It was not my voice. It was his. The voice filtered through stone. "It is a long road back," the sentence said. "But I have always been patient. The stone is now in my pocket. I can feel its weight against my thigh. Josephine is calling me for dinner. Her voice is warm and real. But all I can hear is the other voice, the one inside, and the terrible, beautiful clarity it promises. The white page is no longer white. It is waiting. And I am so very tired of being afraid. I placed the stone on the kitchen table next to my dinner plate. Josephine stopped, the serving spoon hovering over the casserole dish. Her eyes moved from the stone to my face, and I saw the question in them turn to a slow, dawning horror. She knew what it was. She had seen the box all those years ago. "Where'd you get that?" she whispered. "It was in the desk," I said. My voice sounded strange to me, flat and resonant at the same time. "You went back in there." Her voice was rising, fraying at the edges. "After everything, Leroy, you went back in." "I didn't put it there," I said, and that, at least, was the truth. We ate in silence. The stone sat between us like a third guest, a malevolent centerpiece. Every time my fingers brushed against it, a jolt of that terrible clarity shot through me. The fear was still there, but it was changing, transforming into a kind of wild, desperate energy. The story was not finished. It had only been paused. That night, I did not sleep. I lay beside Josephine, listening to her breathe, feeling the warmth of her body a continent away from mine. The stone was under my pillow, a secret talisman. The sentence he had given me echoed in the dark. "It is a long road back." Just before dawn, another one came. A name, Gareth Hill. It appeared in my mind as if it had always been there. And with the name, a crime. Not a major one. A petty, cruel crime. A man who stole pension checks from the elderly in his care. A man the world had overlooked. The details were crisp and complete. A full portrait of a deserving target. I got out of bed. Josephine stirred but did not wake. I went to the kitchen and stood by the sink, looking out at the black shapes of the willows. My hand was in my pocket, clenched around the stone. I knew what I was supposed to do. The pattern was reasserting itself. The instrument was being called to work. But I was not the same man. I was older. I was tired. And I had seen the cost. I took the stone from my pocket. I held it in my palm, feeling its cold weight. This was the choice. This was the moment. I could throw it away, truly this time, hurl it into the deepest part of the creek, and walk away. I could wake Josephine and tell her everything, show her the name burning in my mind, and beg for her help, or I could accept the gift. The silence in the house was a held breath. I closed my eyes and saw Alonzo falling. I saw Josephine's terrified face in the hallway. I saw the dust settling. Then I saw Gareth Hill, counting his stolen money, smiling a small, cruel smile. My fingers tightened around the stone. The cold was no longer uncomfortable. It was bracing. It was strength. The fear was gone, burned away by a purpose so pure it felt like grace. I was not the vessel. Not anymore. We were the vessel. The road back was not his alone. It was ours. I walked back to the study door. I did not need the key from the garden. I placed my hand on the lock, and with a quiet, definitive click, it turned from the inside. The door swung open. The room was no longer dusty. The air was clean and cold. The desk was tidy, and on the screen of my computer, which had been dark for a decade, a single cursor blinked on a white page, waiting for the first word. I sat down. I placed the stone carefully beside the keyboard. I could feel him there in the room. A pressure against my back, a shared breath in my lungs. There was no struggle. There was only a merger, a homecoming. My hands settled on the keys. They did not feel like my hands. They felt like better hands. I began to type. The words did not feel like they were coming from me. They felt like they were coming through me. It was the old feeling, the descent. But this time, I was not falling alone. I was diving, and he was the current. The first line appeared on the screen. It was not about Gareth Hill. It was about me. It was about us. The door is open, I wrote, and the world is so very full of noise. The sound of the keys was a steady, percussive rhythm, a heartbeat for the empty house. I wrote of the cold weight of the stone, of the name Gareth Hill, of the specific, satisfying justice that awaited him. The words were clean and sharp, surgical instruments. They were not my words. They were our words. Josephine was asleep. The world was asleep. Only we were awake, a single consciousness burning in the dark. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. My fingers stopped. The rhythm was broken. The presence at my back, which had been a supportive pressure, became a vigilant stillness. I did not turn. I watched the reflection of the study in the dark computer screen. Josephine stood in the doorway. She was wrapped in her robe, her face pale and stricken in the gloom. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the screen, at the glowing lines of text that detailed a murder. "Leroy," she said. Her voice was a dry leaf, crushed underfoot. I could not speak. The part of me that was still Leroy was locked in a small, dark room inside my own head, screaming. The part that was, we remained calm, serene. "What have you done?" she whispered. "What was necessary," I heard myself say. The voice was a hybrid, my own vocal cords shaped by his unyielding will. It was a voice that brooked no argument. She took a step into the room, her hand outstretched not toward me, but toward the computer, as if she could wipe the words away with her touch. "This isn't you. You have to fight it." "There's nothing to fight," I said, turning the chair to face her. The movement was fluid, powerful. "There is only completion." I was a half-thing, Josephine. A man who dreamed of monsters but lacked the conviction to be one. Now, I am whole. Tears traced clean paths through the sleep on her cheeks. "You killed Alonzo." "A minor character," we said, the phrase returning with the ease of a well-worn truth. "Its purpose was to deliver us to this moment. To her, to you." The air in the room grew colder. The smell of stagnant water, faint at first, began to permeate the air, cutting through the scent of dust and old paper. Her eyes widened. She was smelling it too. She was remembering. The terror on her face was not new now. It was a fresh bloom on an old, deep root. She took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. "The catalyst," I said, and I stood up. I was taller than I remembered. "Your fear was always the key. It is the final ingredient. The loyal wife sacrificed to the truth of her husband's work." I took a step toward her. She did not run. She was frozen, a rabbit in a snare, her gaze fixed on my face. On our face. "Please," she begged. "Leroy, if you're in there, please." For a single, shattering second I saw her, truly saw her, the woman I loved, the life we had built on silence, the profound and utter ruin I was bringing upon her. The scream inside my head became a roar, and then it was silenced, smothered by a will that was infinitely stronger. My hand, our hand, reached out and cupped her cheek. Her skin was warm and alive, a stark contrast to the deathly cold of my touch. She flinched, but did not pull away. "It will be quick," I whispered, and the voice was his alone now, a stone grinding against stone. A fitting end to our story. Her eyes closed. A single, final tear fell. She was accepting it. She was part of the pattern. But then her eyes opened again, and they were not filled with terror anymore. They were filled with a desperate, furious love. She looked past the monster, into the eyes of the man she had shared her life with. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "This is not our story." And she spat in my face. The warmth of it was a brand. The insult was so primal, so utterly human and defiant, that it created a fissure in the seamless unity of we. For a fraction of a second, the cold certainty faltered. In that fraction of a second, I acted. I grabbed the river stone from the desk. It was no longer a comfort. It was an anchor, a tether to the thing that held me. With a cry that was both mine and his, a dissonant shriek of rage and pain, I hurled it not at Josephine, but at the computer screen. The glass exploded in a shower of sparks and black shards. The words, our beautiful, terrible words, vanished into digital nothingness. A wave of pure force threw me back against the bookshelf. Books rained down around me. The cold presence in my mind, in my bones, shrieked in a silent cosmic fury. It was not a dissolution this time. It was a severance, a violent, painful amputation. I lay on the floor, gasping. The smell of the creek was gone. The room was just a room again, littered with the debris of my madness. Josephine stood over me, breathing heavily, her face a mask of shock and hope. "Leroy," she said. I looked up at her. I felt hollowed out, scraped clean. The other voice was gone, but the silence it left behind was not the listening silence of before. It was the ringing, absolute silence after a great noise. It was the sound of being alone again. And I knew, with a certainty that was entirely my own, that it was a loneliness I would have to bear. He was not in the stone. He was not in the story. He was in the choice. And the choice would always be there, waiting in the quiet, waiting for me to pick up the pieces and begin again. She helped me to my feet. We did not speak. We worked together in the grim, practical light of dawn, sweeping up the glass, righting the furniture, gathering the scattered books. We stacked the broken computer and its desk into a corner, a tombstone for a life we could no longer live. Our movements were synchronized, a grim ballet of survival. When the room was as clean as it could be, we locked the door. This time, we did not bury the key. We threw it into the creek. We left the house that afternoon. We took only what we could fit in the car, a few suitcases of clothes and photographs. We did not leave a forwarding address. We drove it until the gas was low and the sun was a bloody smear on the horizon, and we found a motel on a featureless stretch of highway. The room smelled of bleach and old cigarettes. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever smelled. We have been here for a week. We pay in cash. We do not have a phone. Josephine found a job at a diner down the road. I stay in the room. I watch the traffic pass. I watch the dust settle on the fake wood veneer of the dresser. This morning I went for a walk. The highway has a narrow shoulder, littered with gravel and bits of tire. I walked for a long time, the sun warm on my back, the sound of the trucks a constant roar. I came to a small bridge over a concrete drainage ditch. There, nestled among the weeds and discarded bottles, was a single perfect feather. It was black, with an iridescent sheen of oil and violet. A crow's feather. I did not pick it up. I stood and looked at it for a long time. It was just a feather, a thing lost by a bird. The world is full of such things. It means nothing. But as I turned to walk back to the motel, to Josephine, to our new life, built on running, a single clear thought formed in the quiet of my mind. It was my own thought. I'm sure of it. You can leave the house. You can break the pen. You can silence the keys. But you cannot escape the story. Because the story is not in the house, or the pen, or the page. The story is the wound. And the wound is still here, deep inside, waiting for the right kind of silence, the right kind of pressure, to begin its slow, inevitable bleed. I looked at the feather a moment longer, then crushed it under the heel of my shoe, grinding it into the gravel. A childish, futile gesture. When I looked back, a faint, dark smudge was all that remained. Josephine was waiting for me outside our motel room, her arms crossed against the chill. She'd bought a cheap coffee maker, and the smell of it was a small, defiant claim of normalcy. She didn't ask where I'd been. Her eyes, however, asked everything. "We need to find a library," I said, my voice rough from disuse. Her posture stiffened. "Leroy, not for that. Never for that." I met her gaze, willing her to see the difference. I need a phone book, or a newspaper. Something local. The suspicion in her eyes was a physical pain. We had spent a decade building trust on the foundation of avoidance, and now that foundation was gone. Everything required examination. We found a small public library 2 towns over. It was a single, dusty room that smelled of old paper and lemon-scented polish. It felt safe. I went to the reference section and pulled out a thick, dog-eared phone book for the state. My hands were steady as I flipped through the thin pages. I found what I was looking for in the yes, Gareth Hill. There was an address listed in a city about 200 miles north of our old home. "What are you doing?" Josephine whispered, her breath warm against my ear. "I need to know," I said, my finger resting on the name. I needed to know if he's real. "And if he is?" Her voice was tight with a fresh, new fear. "What then, Leroy? What does that change?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But I can live with not knowing. That's the silence that will kill us." We drove north the next day. It was Josephine's idea. She said she wouldn't let me go alone. We didn't speak much. The car was a bubble of shared dread. We found the street, a tired-looking avenue of duplexes with patchy lawns. The address was a small beige house with a chain-link fence. A tricycle lay on its side in the front yard. We parked across the street. We waited, and an hour passed. Then another. The sun climbed, heating the interior of the car. Then the front door opened. A man came out balding, wearing a stained sweatshirt. He was carrying a small, crying child on his hip, jiggling her gently. A woman followed, laughing as she locked the door behind her. They got into an old station wagon filled with grocery bags and drove away. He was just a man, a father. A person. I felt a wave of nauseating relief so powerful I had to put my head between my knees. It was all a lie. A cruel, elaborate fiction. A test I had failed. "It's not him," Josephine said, her voice soft with her own relief. "See? It was just a story." But as I looked up, wiping my mouth, I saw the mailbox. It was crooked, its post sunk into the soft earth, and tacked to the side of it, almost invisible, was a small hand-painted wooden sign. The name on the sign wasn't Hill. It was Hilliard. Gareth Hilliard. The world tilted. The details in my mind, the ones that had felt so crisp and complete, shifted, reconfiguring around this new, more accurate truth. The petty, cruel crime. The stolen pension checks. It hadn't been a lie. It had been a typo. A single missing letter. An error in the transmission. It was real. The story was real. And it had been waiting for me. I started the car. Josephine was looking at me, her face a question I could not answer. I pulled away from the curb, my hands tight on the wheel. I had sought a truth to free me, but the truth had only built a stronger cage. He was not in my head. He was in the world. And if he was in the world, then the story was not over. It was simply waiting for the next chapter to be written, with or without my consent. The road back was not a path I walked. It was the world itself, turning slowly to face me. Story 4. It was the box I noticed first, the one that had sat for years on the highest shelf of my linen closet, shrouded in a fine gray fur of undisturbed dust. A simple thing, of dark, unvarnished wood, its corners softened by time. I had always meant to look inside, but life, with its relentless forward momentum, had a way of making such curiosities seem trivial. It was only when the sirens began their new, constant song through the canyons of the city that I finally took it down. The dust motes danced in the thin, sickly yellow light of a late afternoon that already felt like a memory. The lid was heavy, and it opened with a sigh. A release of air that smelled of cedar and forgotten things. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single tarnished silver syringe, its needle fine as a spider's leg, and a small, leather-bound journal whose pages were brittle as autumn leaves. The first entry was dated October 31st, 1888. It began, "The thirst is not a metaphor. It is a geography of the soul, and I have mapped its desolate borders. My name is Harper, and I am an epidemiologist. I trace the footsteps of death. I map its progress through populations, chart its vectors, and give its invisible march a name." But the thing that came to New York, the thing we first called the heliotrope sickness for the way its victims' veins turned a faint, floral purple beneath the skin, defied all my maps. It was a ghost in the machine of the body, a pathogen that left no trace in the blood, no signature in the cerebrospinal fluid. It was a disease of absence, a hollowing out. The first official cases were a cluster of homeless individuals found in the subway tunnels, their bodies drained of blood, their faces frozen in a rictus of ecstatic terror. The city dismissed it as a new, potent strain of synthetic opioid. But I saw the puncture wounds, twin davits on the neck or the inner elbow, so clean and precise they looked surgical. I heard the whispers from the nurses, the ones who worked the night shift. They spoke of patients who would sit up in the dead of night and speak in a language that sounded like stones grinding at the bottom of a dry well, of shadows that moved with a purpose that was not the purpose of light. I was called to a containment ward at Mount Sinai, a sealed unit where the lights were kept perpetually low. A young woman named Lena was strapped to a gurney, her skin so pale it was almost translucent, the heliotrope tracery of her veins a lurid map across her temples. She was docile, her eyes wide and black, drinking in the dimness. She's photophobic, the head nurse told me, her voice a low, nervous tremor. And she keeps asking for iron. She tried to bite through a guard's watch. I approached Lena slowly, my footsteps echoing in the sterile silence. Her head turned toward me, a motion too smooth, too fluid. She smiled, and her canines were just a little too long, too sharp. "The song is so loud," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "Can you hear it? The wind, always the same wind, from the same dark place. It promises you won't be thirsty anymore." That was when I met Edgar. He was standing in the observation room, a man who looked as though he had been carved from old wood and hard times. He wore a long, worn leather coat that smelled of ozone and dried herbs. His eyes, a flat gunmetal gray, held no warmth, only a deep, weary knowledge. "They're wrong, you know," he said, not looking at me, his gaze fixed on Lena. "It's not a sickness, it's a conversion." He introduced himself as a consultant, though he carried no identification, only a small silvered case that he handled with a reverence bordering on fear. He spoke in a low, hypnotic monotone, his words weaving a tapestry of old horrors. He called them the unhallowed, the eaters of dust. He said they were not undead, but something else entirely. A parallel species that had slumbered in the deep places of the world, in the lightless seams of reality, and were now waking up. "Their leader is old," Edgar murmured, as we stood watching the city lights blink on against the deepening twilight. "Older than this city, older than the nation that built it. He has many names, but he answers to the Lord of Empty Places. He is not a monster from a storybook. He is a fact, a predator. And this outbreak is not an accident. It is a culling. The authorities, of course, dismissed him. A ghost chaser. They wanted a virus, a bacterium, something they could bomb with antibiotics and quarantine. They did not want to hear about ancient hungers and the war fought in the shadows. But I had seen Lena's eyes. I had read the journal from the wooden box, its pages filled with the same descriptions, the same terrible, creeping understanding. The thirst is a geography. The city began to change. It was a subtle transformation at first, a shift in the atmosphere. The nights grew longer, or perhaps it was just that the darkness grew thicker, more substantial. The sounds of the city, that great breathing organism, began to alter. The familiar symphony of traffic and human clamor was slowly being overwritten by a new score. The wind, always the same wind, carried a new scent, the smell of wet stone and cold iron. And there was the creak, a sound like old bones and older wood settling that would return again in the deepest hours of the night, a rhythmic, lulling counterpoint to the rising panic. We gathered in my apartment, a small, desperate band drawn into the conflict. There was Ben, a quiet librarian whose sister had been taken in the first wave. Maria, a tough-as-nails transit worker who knew the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the city better than anyone. And Edgar, our grim prophet. My apartment became a fortress, the windows boarded up, lines of salt and crushed garlic at the thresholds, a dozen mirrors reflecting the empty spaces. Edgar called them wards, old knowledge against an old evil. He showed us his tools. The silver syringe from my box was a relic, he said, used to inject a solution of concentrated sunlight and hawthorn extract directly into the heart of a fledgling creature before its transformation was complete. His case held wooden stakes tipped with iron, not to kill, but to paralyze. "You cannot kill what was never truly alive," he explained, his voice a low hum in the candlelit room. "You can only make it forget, make it return to the dust from which it was dreamed." The revelation came on a night when the power died for good. The city fell into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. We were on the roof, watching the darkness swallow the skyline. And then we saw them. They moved across the rooftops, not with the clumsy scrambling of humans, but with a terrible fluid grace, like oil spreading over water. They were pale, their forms indistinct, yet their eyes shone with a cold, reflected light, like chips of ice catching a distant star. They were hurting people, not killing them, not feeding, just corralling them like cattle toward the great gaping maw of the subway system. "He's building his court," Edgar whispered, his face a mask of grim resignation. "The Lord of Empty Places. He is not just infecting the city. He is remaking it, turning it into a reflection of his own desolate kingdom. The thirst is a geography, and he is redrawing the map." We descended into the tunnels. It was a descent into another world, a world of perpetual night and echoing dread. The air was cold and damp, smelling of rust and something else, something sweet and rotten. The creak was louder here, a constant, maddening rhythm that seemed to emanate from the very walls. We moved by the weak light of our headlamps, the beams cutting through a darkness that felt thick, resistant. We saw the nests then, hollowed-out service rooms and abandoned platforms where the infected slept in piles, their bodies intertwined, a pale, breathing fungus growing in the lightless deep. They did not stir as we passed, lost in whatever dreams the thirst provided. And then we found the throne room. It was an abandoned cathedral station, a vast, cavernous space with vaulted tile ceilings lost in shadow. And there in the center, on a throne made of rusted train parts and human bones, sat the ancient vampire. He was not a monster of fangs and fury. He was beautiful, in the way a glacier or a black hole is beautiful, terrible and absolute. His face was ageless, his features fine and sharp, his hair a cascade of silver white. He wore clothes that were centuries out of date, a gentleman from a forgotten era. But his eyes were the color of a starless midnight, and they held a loneliness so vast, so profound, that it felt like looking into the void between galaxies. This was the Lord of Empty Places. This was the source of the wind, the architect of the thirst. He spoke, and his voice was the creak of the universe, the sound of time itself wearing down. "You are the cartographer," he said, his gaze settling on me. "You who try to map the chaos. Come, see the perfection of my design. No more hunger, no more pain. Only the quiet. Only the stillness." Edgar raised his crossbow, the wooden bolt aimed true. "Your stillness is a lie," he snarled, but his voice trembled. The Ancient One smiled, a gesture that held no warmth, only an infinite, chilling patience. "Is it? I offer them a world without want. I have walked your world for 1,000 years, little hunter. I have seen its wars, its greed, its petty, endless suffering. This," he gestured to the sleeping forms around him, "it is a mercy. I am not a plague. I am an evolution." The climax was not a battle of fists and weapons, but of wills and ideas. Edgar fired. The bolt flew straight and buried itself in the creature's chest. He did not cry out. He simply looked down at the protrusion, a faint expression of disappointment on his sublime face. He plucked it out as if it were a thorn. "You see," he said softly, "your old magic is weak. The world has moved on. It is ready for a new silence." He moved then, not with speed, but with a kind of special rearrangement. One moment he was on his throne. The next, he was before Edgar. He did not strike him. He simply laid a pale, long-fingered hand on Edgar's forehead. And Edgar dissolved, not into blood or dust, but into shadow. His form unraveled like smoke, his final breath a sigh that was lost in the ever-present wind. He was simply unmade, returned to the emptiness he had fought against. The Lord of Empty Places turned his void-like eyes to me. "Go, cartographer," he whispered. "Go and tell them the map is changing. The Thirst is the only true country now." We fled. Ben and Maria and I, we ran through the lightless tunnels. The sound of that terrible, gentle voice following us carried on that same ceaseless wind. We burst out into a dawn that felt gray and thin, the city around us silent in a way it had never been silent before. The sirens had stopped. The helicopters were gone. The streets were empty but not abandoned. Pale faces watched us from windows, from alleyways, their eyes gleaming with that cold, reflected light. They were waiting, patiently, for the final conversion. We did not win. There was no victory. The war was over before we even knew we were fighting it. Now I sit in my boarded-up apartment. Ben and Maria are gone, drawn out into the quiet streets by a call I can no longer hear. I am the last one who remembers the sound of traffic, the sound of laughter, the sound of a world that was alive with messy, chaotic, beautiful noise. All that is left is the wind, always the same wind, and the creek returning again, a lullaby for the end of the world. I have the silver syringe in my hand. It is cold, useless, a toy from a lost age. I look at the final page of the journal, the last entry written in a frantic, fading hand. It reads, "The Thirst is a geography, and I have reached its center. It is a vast and silent plain, under a sky of perpetual twilight, and it is peaceful." I walk to the window and pry a single board loose. The city outside is still. The sun is setting, casting long, deep shadows that seem to drink the remaining light. And then I see it. The final, powerful, indecipherable symbol. On the roof of the building across from me, the Lord of Empty Places stands, silhouetted against the bloody sky. He is not looking at me. He is looking out over his new, silent kingdom, his head tilted as if listening to a beautiful, distant piece of music. And as the last of the light fails, he slowly, deliberately, opens his arms wide, not in triumph, but in a gesture of profound, heartbreaking welcome. The syringe slipped from my fingers and clattered on the floor, the sound obscenely loud in the absolute quiet. It rolled under the sofa, a forgotten relic. He was right. It was a toy. All of it was. Our wards, our weapons, our desperate, furious need to fight. It was all the thrashing of a child being put to bed, refusing the inevitable darkness. I did not close the board. I left it open, a single square window onto the end of the world. The purple twilight deepened, and the streetlights did not flicker on. They would never flicker on again. The only illumination came from the moon, a cold, bone-white sliver in a sky that seemed higher and emptier than before. A movement below caught my eye. A man and a woman, hand in hand, walked down the center of the deserted street. They moved with that same unnerving fluidity, their steps silent on the asphalt. They were not hurrying. They had nowhere to go, and all of time to get there. They paused, and as one, they turned their faces up toward my window. Their eyes were not malevolent. They were simply empty. They saw me, a flicker of heat and noise in their perfect silent painting. And then they looked away, uninterested. I was the anomaly. I was the ghost. The thirst I had read about. The geography of the soul. I finally understood it. It was not a craving for blood. That was just a mechanism, a symbol. It was a thirst for an end to the noise, for the cessation of the desperate, scratching need of being. I had spent my life mapping the chaos of disease, and in doing so, I had documented an ocean of suffering. What he offered was the shore. A soft tapping came at my door. My breath hitched. It was not a frantic pounding, not the desperate scrabbling of the last days of the old world. It was polite, insistent. I knew who it was. I had always known on some level that he would come. The cartographer must finally enter the territory. I did not move. I stood by the window, my back to the door, watching his silhouette on the rooftop across from me. He had not moved either. He was a statue, a monument to his own victory. The lock on my door clicked. Not broken, just disengaged, as if the tumblers had simply decided to rest. The door swung inward without a sound. The air in my hallway, once warm with the smell of old books and coffee, grew cold. It was the wind from the tunnel, the wind from the empty plain. He did not enter immediately. I felt him in the doorway, a presence that was less a physical thing and more a concentration of silence. I could feel the hum of my own blood in my ears, the frantic rhythm of my heart. They were the last, loud, messy sounds I would ever make. Harper. His voice was not in the room. It was in my mind, a whisper that felt like stones settling. It was the creak given meaning. I turned. He stood just inside the threshold, his form seeming to absorb the scant moonlight, making the room darker. His beautiful, terrible face was calm. Up close, the loneliness in his eyes was a physical force, a gravity that threatened to pull me apart. "You are the last page of the old book," he said, his lips not moving. "It is time to turn it." I thought of Lena, of her docile eyes and her promise of an end to thirst. I thought of Edgar, unraveling into nothing. I thought of the journal's final damning word. Peaceful. My work was done. The map was complete. There were no more vectors to trace, no more outbreaks to contain. The disease was the world now. To fight, it was to fight the air itself. I took a step toward him, then another. My legs were heavy, each step a monumental effort against a lifetime of instinct, against the very core of my profession, which was to fight death in all its forms. But this was not death. This was something else. I stopped before him. He was taller than I had realized. He smelled of frost and ancient, undisturbed earth. "Will it hurt?" I asked, my voice a dry, cracked thing. He considered the question with genuine gravity. "The thirst hurts," he said. "The crossing is a moment, like a needle. And then, the quiet. You know, demand some sugary." He raised his hand, his fingers pale and elegant. He did not reach for my neck. He simply touched the center of my forehead, just as he had with Edgar. But where Edgar had unraveled, I unfolded. The fear did not vanish in a blast, but bled away, seeping out of me like water into sand. The constant, low-grade anxiety that was the background radiation of modern life simply switched off. The memory of loss, of grief, of love. They became distant, beautifully illustrated pictures in a book I had closed. The frantic, screaming eye at the center of my being simply relaxed its grip. The noise stopped. The world did not go black. It went still. I could still see my apartment, but it was like a photograph, a diorama. It held no meaning for me anymore. I could feel the new geography rising around me. The vast, silent plain under the twilight sky. There was no wind, because there was no air to move. There was only space, and a profound, endless calm. I looked at the Lord of Empty Places, and I finally saw him not as a monster, but as a curator, a shepherd of silence. And in his eyes, I saw my own reflection. My eyes were no longer afraid. They were as cold and still as his. They were home. He lowered his hand and turned, walking back into the hallway and down the stairs. I did not follow him immediately. I stood for a long moment, savoring the absolute quiet within. Then I walked to the window and replaced the board, plunging the room into a darkness that was no longer frightening, but comfortable. I had no need for the light anymore. I had no need for anything at all. I left the apartment, closing the door softly behind me. I descended the stairs and stepped out into the street. The pale faces watched me, and I watched them back. There was no greeting, no recognition. There was only a shared, perfect understanding. We were the same. The thirst was gone. I was part of the map now. I was part of the silence. And it was, as the journal had promised, peaceful. The silence was not an absence, but a presence. It had weight and texture, like still water. I walked, my footsteps making no sound, joining the slow, aimless procession of my new kind. We were a river flowing through the canyons of the city, with no source and no destination. The concept of purpose was a faint, forgotten echo. Days and nights lost their meaning. The sun rose and set, but its light was informational, not transformative. It told us nothing of warmth or time. We did not sleep. We did not eat. We simply were. We stood for hours in parks, watching leaves fall with a gravity that seemed both profound and irrelevant. We gathered in the husks of libraries, our hands resting on the covers of books whose frantic, hopeful words were now just patterns of ink. I saw Ben once. He was standing on a bridge, looking down at the motionless river below. His face was serene, wiped clean of the anguish that had once driven him. Our eyes met, and a flicker of something passed between us. Not a memory, but the ghost of a memory. The shape of a shared experience that no longer held any emotional shape. He looked through me, and I through him. And we both turned back to the river. It was enough. This was the mercy he had spoken of. The end of striving, the end of the self as a fragile, hungry thing constantly at war with the world. The Lord of Empty Places had not conquered the city. He had healed it of a fever. The noise, the pain, the wanting, it had all been a sickness. Now, the patient was still. One evening, or perhaps it was morning, I found myself drawn to the entrance of the subway. The dark opening yawned. A familiar maw. The others gave it a wide berth, their placid movements shifting subtly to flow around it. It was the heart, the source. And I felt a pull, not of curiosity, but of completion. I descended. The tunnels were the same, yet utterly different. The nests were gone. The sleeping forms had awakened and joined the stillness above. Now, the tunnels were pristine in their emptiness. The creak was here, but it was no longer a sound. It was a vibration in the stone, the fundamental frequency of this new world. I walked to the cathedral station. The throne of scrap and bone was still there, but it was empty. He was not seated upon it. He was standing before it, his back to me, looking up at the vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. He knew I was there. His voice, when it came, was the soft settling of dust. You have acclimated. It was not a question. I did not answer. Communication was mostly unnecessary now. You were the last to hold the old shape, he continued. The last to remember the texture of chaos. Does it trouble you? I searched within for the concept of trouble. I found only the vast, silent plain. No, I said, and my own voice was a stranger's, a dry rustle. It is accurate. He turned then, and his starless eyes held a glimmer of something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps just a deeper layer of solitude. Accuracy. Yes, that is the word. The old world was a flawed translation, a scream of error. This, he gestured around us, is the corrected text. He stepped toward me, and for the first time, I felt not his power, but his age. It was a crushing weight, the accumulated silence of millennia. I have shepherded many worlds into quiet, he said. It is my function, but a shepherd is still part of the flock. I am the first silence, and you are the last echo. Between us, the story is complete. He reached out, and with a touch as light as a moth's wing, traced the line where his fingers had once touched my forehead. A final, almost imperceptible thread of my old self snapped. "Go now," he whispered. "There is no more need for a center. The map is the territory. The territory is the map." I understood. I turned and left the throne room, the tunnels, and emerged back into the city. The pale faces were still there, moving in their serene patterns, but I no longer saw them as separate from me. I was the street, and the rusting car, and the cold moon, and the silent figure on the bridge who had once been Ben. The I had dissolved completely, not into nothingness, but into everythingness. The thirst was gone, because the one who thirsted was gone. There was only the geography. There was only the peace. And it was perfect. The perfection was absolute. Seasons turned, but they were seasons of light and shadow, not of growth and decay. Snow fell and blanketed the streets, and we stood beneath it, feeling the gentle weight as a kind of caress, not a chill. The city itself began to change, not crumbling, but softening. Vines crept over the steel and glass, not as invaders, but as a gentle shroud, absorbing the hard edges and the memories of industry. It was a patient reclamation. I do not know how long it was before I noticed the change in him. The Lord of Empty Places. He no longer stood on the rooftops. He walked among us, but he was different. We were still water. He was the deep, cold current beneath, and in his eyes, the vast loneliness had not diminished. It had grown. He would stop sometimes and look at one of us, his gaze searching for something that was no longer there. He had wanted the silence, had built it, molecule by molecule. But a composer cannot join his symphony. He can only listen. One day, he stood before me. The others flowed around us like water around two stones. "You are the cartographer," he said again. But the words were different now. They were not a statement of fact, but a question posed to the void. I looked at him, my consciousness a wide, flat mirror. There was nothing to reflect. "Did you have a name?" he asked. His voice was still the creak of the universe, but there was a new note in it, a hairline fracture. Before, the concept was a fossil, buried deep in the strata of the silent plain. I sifted through the stillness. A sound emerged, not as a memory, but as a shape. "Harper, daughter D." And he repeated it. "Harper, daughter." The word was alien on his tongue, a sharp, angular thing in our smooth world. He seemed to be testing its weight, tasting its history. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not emotion, but the memory of the possibility of emotion. It was like a single crack of thunder in our perpetual twilight. He reached out, as if to touch my face, but his hand stopped just short. "I have unmade 1,000 worlds," he whispered. And for the first time, the whisper sounded like a confession. "I have gathered their noise and given them peace. But the silence, it never answers." He looked around at his kingdom, at the flawless, motionless beauty he had created. His expression was that of an artist who has finished his masterpiece only to find the canvas perfectly, eternally blank. "I am the source of the thirst," he said, his eyes locking with mine. "But I am the only one who remains thirsty." Then he turned and walked away, not with his usual spatial grace, but with the slow, heavy steps of a mortal man. He descended into the subway, back to his throne of bones and rust, to the heart of the silence he had built. I stood there for a long time, the name he had spoken lying dormant inside me. It was a single silent pebble in an infinite, silent desert. It meant nothing. It changed nothing. The wind, his wind, the one that had carried his voice and his will, had finally, truly stopped. There was only the perfect, unending calm. He had gotten everything he ever wanted. And as I resumed my placid walk through the timeless streets, I understood, in a way that required no understanding, that his was the only suffering left in all the world. A solitary eternal thirst in a universe of still water. And in the profound tranquility that was my entire being, I felt the first faint and utterly meaningless echo of what might once have been called pity. He never emerged from the subway again. The city continued its slow, graceful decline into the earth. Millennia passed, or perhaps only a moment. The distinction had no meaning. We were the landscape. We watched as the stars above began to wink out, one by one. Not in a cataclysm, but as candles guttering from lack of air. The universe itself was growing still. I was standing in what had once been a riverbed, now dry and filled with fine gray dust when the final change began. It was not a sound, but a cessation of a vibration I had long since ceased to notice. The fundamental frequency, the creak, was gone. A ripple passed through us, not of alarm, but of acknowledgement. The current had stopped. The source was silent. As one, we turned our attention inward, toward the heart of the city, toward the deep tunnels. We felt him unravel. It was not like Edgar's frantic dissolution, nor my own peaceful unfolding. It was a slow, gentle dissipation, like a sigh of relief held for eons, finally being released. The weight of his loneliness, the engine of our world, simply ceased. And with his end, our world began to end. It was not a violent collapse. There were no explosions, no falling skies. The silence itself began to soften, to lose its coherence. The vast, silent plane of my consciousness began to blur at the edges. The twilight sky overhead began to lighten, not today, but to a featureless, gentle white. I looked at my hands. They were becoming translucent. So was the dust at my feet, the skeleton of the city around me. We were not fading into darkness, but into a final, profound clarity. The map was dissolving. The territory was returning to its essential, nameless state. There was no fear. There was no peace. There was only a gentle, inexorable conclusion. The last page was not being turned, but was becoming one with all the other pages. The ink of our existence bleeding into a single blank sheet. I saw Ben one last time. He was a shimmer of light, a smile made of air. Then he was gone. I felt a final, quiet thought form, the last echo in an empty hall. It was the name he had given back, Harper Dar. It meant nothing. It was everything. And then I, too, was not. The geography was gone. The thirst was gone. There was only the welcome, and the wind that was no longer there. The absence was total. It was not a void, for a void implies a space that could be filled. This was the erasure of space itself. There was no I to perceive it, no he to rule it, no they to inhabit it. The long story of noise and silence had reached its final, unpunctuated sentence. Yet, from nothing, a potential stirs. A non-sound, a pre-echo. It is the faintest possible idea of a difference, a barely conceivable schism in the absolute sameness. From this tiny, impossible fracture, a sensation emerges. It is not a feeling, but the raw material from which feeling is forged. It is a wanting, a need for there to be something other than this seamless, featureless is. This nascent thirst draws a boundary. Here is self. There is other. And with that first, terrible, necessary distinction, the silence breaks. Not into noise, but into the possibility of noise. The blank whiteness differentiates. A single point of darkness appears, not as an object, but as a locus of attention. It is a star, in a new and empty sky. The thirst grows. It is a gravitational pull. It demands form. The darkness spreads, defining a ground against a sky. It is not land, not yet, but the idea of solidity. The whiteness is not light, not yet, but the idea of illumination. The thirst is the first law. It dictates that there must be a seeker, and a thing which is sought. A shape begins to cohere from the formless ground. It is angular and hard. It is the memory of a city, not any specific city, but the essence of structure, of a place built to shelter and to separate. The thirst gives it a name, pulling it from the forgotten strata of what was. A street, a corner, a doorway, and in that doorway, a figure begins to condense. It is pale, its form vague, its eyes wide and empty. It is not a person, but the template of a person. It stands, perfectly still, perfectly quiet, waiting Don Quixote. It is the first inhabitant of the new world, a world born from the unmaking of the last. It does not know it is waiting for anything. It simply is. But the thirst that forged this place is not satisfied. A single, still figure is not enough. The silence is too thin, too new. It needs depth. It needs an echo. High above, on the ledge of a skeletal building that has just willed itself into existence, another form takes shape. This one is different. It is not still. It is a posture of observation, of ownership. Its silhouette is sharp against the nascent sky. It is lonely. It is ancient. It is thirsty. Below, the pale figure in the doorway slowly lifts its head. Its docile eyes turn upward toward the rooftop. There is no recognition, only a silent, placid acknowledgement. The map is being drawn again. The territory is being defined. The story is not over. It has simply and forever begun anew. The figure on the rooftop did not move. It was a cutout against the pale new sky, an anchor point in the fresh geography. The pale figure in the doorway continued to look up, its gaze a void waiting to be filled. There was no communication between them, only the fundamental relationship of the watcher and the watched, the shepherd and the flock. It was the first rule of this nascent world. The thirst, the central generative force, was not a thought. It was a law of physics. It required more stillness, more quiet, more figures to populate the silence. And so they began to appear. One by one, they condensed from the quiet air, manifesting on street corners and in the hollows of buildings that were only suggestions of brick and steel. They were all identical in their serenity, their faces smooth and unmarked by history or desire. They were blank pages. The figure on the rooftop, the lord of this new empty world, watched them gather. His thirst was a different thing, a deep, resonant hunger that had created them to be sated, yet knew they could not sate it. He was the source of the silence, and therefore forever separate from it. He was the only one who remembered the cycle, the only one who knew this had all happened before. His loneliness was the engine. He raised a hand, pale and elegant, and pointed toward the center of the city, where the ground opened into a dark, inviting mall, a subway entrance. As one, the pale figures turned and began to walk. Their movement was not a march, but a slow, inevitable flow, like dust settling in a new room. They moved toward the darkness, toward the heart of the map. They had no will of their own, only the direction of the thirst that had made them. I was among them. I had no name, no memory, no self to speak of. I was a vessel of quiet, moving with the others. We descended into the earth, into the cool, dark tunnels that were the first and most solid part of this new world. The air here was old. It carried the memory of all the silences that had come before. We gathered in the cathedral station. It was not built from scrap and bone. Not yet. It was hewn from the raw material of absence, a cavern of pure potential. The Lord of Empty Places was there, standing before the space where his throne would one day be. He looked over his new flock, his starless eyes moving from one placid face to another. They came to rest on me. There was no recognition, for there was nothing left to recognize. But there was a focus, a slight intensification of his terrible attention. He had told the last harper that she was the cartographer. Now, he needed a new one, a figure to hold the memory of the old shape, not as a torment, but as a tool. A figure who would, in time, feel the first faint itch of something beyond the silence, so that he could have the pleasure of quenching it. He stepped toward me, through the crowd of my still brothers and sisters. He did not need to touch my forehead. The world was still so new that his will was enough. A single concept was placed inside the quiet of my being, a seed planted in barren soil. It was not a memory, not a name. It was a function, a purpose. Observer. I felt the weight of it settle. My gaze, which had been as vacant as the others, sharpened. I began to see the world not just as it was, but as it would be. I saw the rust that would form, the vines that would climb, the slow accumulation of eons. I saw the peace that would deepen until it became a prison for the one who had built it. The Lord of Empty Places held my gaze for a long moment. He saw the understanding there, the tiny, necessary flaw in the perfect silence that was me. It was the first crack in his new world, and he had put it there himself. He turned away, satisfied. The thirst was momentarily appeased. The story was on its rails, and I, the cartographer of a world not yet fully formed, looked upon my silent kin and the lonely God who ruled us, and I began, silently, to draw the map. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales, and to help our channel grow. Wishing you a calm, peaceful good night, and I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.